for the pre-flight. The thing that we really need to pre-flight is the pre-show. Please, the two of you, work out which of you has a half an hour of content that you're going to stick before.
But the fun, John, the fun is neither Marco nor I knows who's going to win.
Yeah, right. But see, the problem is when you get this, 100-year storm thing where we have 45 minutes before the little modem sound. So work something out, please.
All right, an anonymous Apple employee writes to make yet another correction. This is turning into the T whatever feedback. Another correction with regard to always-on VPNs and work devices and so on. This anonymous Apple employee writes, the always-on VPN mentioned on a past episode cannot, all caps, be implemented on a user-owned iPhone or iPad. That policy can only be applied on supervised devices, which, if you recall, is just Apple's fancy word for a corporate-owned iPhone. You can only supervise an iPhone if the company purchased it through a specific reseller or carrier, or the company takes over the ownership of your phone, which is extremely rare. And this usually only happens with donated devices. It's a tedious process which requires a full phone erase in multiple steps. In other words, a company cannot snoop your web traffic unless they own the phone. Moving right along, Julian Torres writes, there's a preference in settings on iOS under contacts called short names that allows you to set the system-wide preference. What was the context for this? I don't recall.
It was like the mom and dad, whether you use their names
yes.
or their nicknames in your address book and what shows up where. And I was trying to recall that there was some setting that you could use to control this, but that not all apps honored it. This, I think, was the setting I was thinking of. I seem to recall also messing with this setting and expecting it to work on the Mac, or there's an equivalent on the Mac. But it's the type of thing where you can suggest that this is how things show up. And I bet if you call the right Apple APIs, it honors this setting. But if you don't and just pulling the contact data directly in your app, I suppose you could just do whatever you want. But anyway, in case you're wondering, that's where it is in iOS settings.
Yep, good to know. All right, my buddy Brian King sent us a link to a talk from Skydio, and I believe Skydio makes drones. And this talk is like an hour and a half long. And I was talking to him privately outside of the feedback that he had sent us. And he said, basically, just skip around in this video and darn near anywhere you'll see something cool. And I don't remember exactly what the timestamp was, but at some point they had these drones following a person like running or cycling or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but the drone was flying in between power lines. It was amazing. I do not understand how this could possibly work. Oh, it looks like it was somewhere around between 10 and 15 minutes, I think. Anyways, it is a fascinating video. Yeah, at about 14 minutes, I see it now as I'm jogging through it. It is really bananas to watch as you see it going above, below, and through these power lines, which I assure you, as someone who is now an experienced drone pilot, except not really, that is terrifying to think about doing. And I have pretty much the smallest drone on the market. So this is extremely, extremely cool.
Maybe to watch the entire hour-long video, that's what it's about, how they do that. All the different sensing that they use to figure out how not to hit things when flying through the air. It's cool.
All right, moving right along, we have some follow-out. The talk show, episode 309, Pinkies on the Semicolon. That was where some guy joined John Gruber on his show, and it was really good. And I wanted to call your attention to it because I really enjoyed it. It was a really nice overview and kind of history lesson about the Mac, and I thought it was really, really good and well worth the couple of hours that it took to listen. So well done, whoever that random person was.
There was some guy named John Syracusa. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. It was really good. It was nice to hear John able to rant in his giant paragraphs about the Mac, very hypercritical style. For those listeners out there who miss hypercritical and who want a show where Casey and I aren't here and it's mostly John ranting in these like large composed arguments, this had a lot of that in it, and I really appreciated that as a listener.
I was just going to say the opposite, that I felt like on that show what I was doing was trying to give the Cliff Notes versions of what people get on ATP, because everything I said on the talk show are things we've discussed in the past in the ATP, but I have to give the compressed version because it's just one appearance as opposed to over weeks and months. So if you're listening to ATP, you're getting the pure uncut stuff. But if you want the Cliff Notes, you can check out that episode of the talk show.
Well, either way, I thought it was very good. And if you're a listener to this show, and if you don't regularly listen to the talk show, you might want to make some time for this one because it's very, very good. All right. John, I think especially has lots of thoughts about Clubhouse. Can you tell me about this, John?
Yep. I've been still hanging out in the Clubhouse, as they say. No one says that. A couple of thoughts and extra bits about Clubhouse. The first one is, and I forgot to mention this last time, it occurred to me, even when I was just first participating in these Clubhouse rooms, so that you've got speakers who are quote unquote on stage and they can nominate other people to come up on stage and speak, right? And the rest of the time, there's an audience. Like the way it's presented is the speakers are at the top with their little avatars. Then there's a second section, which says it's like people that the speakers follow. And then there's a third section where the avatars get a little bit smaller, and that's like everybody else, right? And anybody can be nominated to be a speaker, and then they go back down to their thing. So when you're in a room and someone is talking and you're in the audience, the total number of things that you can do in the audience are, number one, raise your hand, which says, hey, I would like to be nominated as a speaker, to let the people who are speakers know that they can pick you or not, right? Or two, leave the room. And it like when I was down there, I was thinking of our podcast where we do a thing kind of like Clubhouse, where there's a bunch of people right now who are in a chat room. And although we can't nominate them to speak on the show, they can talk to each other through text in the chat while we are on stage. And I find that an incredibly valuable thing. That you can't invite every single person from the audience up to be a speaker in any kind of Clubhouse room. I haven't seen any that have been like that. It's always like you nominate the lucky few who get to talk, and the rest of the people are just in the chat room, and they don't get to do anything in Clubhouse. I'm not saying they should add a text chat, but I feel like it's something I'm used to and would find valuable. I like the idea that the audience can speak amongst themselves. Now, that's a huge can of worms, as we know. Not every audience is as well behaved and wonderful as our chat room. Once you get more than a handful of people in there, then it just becomes a giant cesspool. See any chat in Twitch or live chat in a YouTube stream or anything like that. So I fully understand the problems, and I'm thinking they're making the right call for this stage in their startup process. But I have to say that I missed the chat room experience when in Clubhouse. Have either one of you done any more Clubhouse observing / participating?
Yeah, I think all three of us are. I think maybe it was me and some with John and some with Marco were in a chat. What was that? It was
that the one that Gruber joined and pointed everyone to about like UX design and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what it was, and it was good. I enjoyed it. I don't personally see this as something that I would do often, but if somebody whose work I enjoy is talking about a topic I find interesting and I'm not also doing something else, which is a lot of ifs. I think it would be something I would enjoy. And it just so happened that particular time, I saw that John was doing something and I enjoyed John's work, and it was something that I thought was interesting, and it ended up being interesting. And so I popped in for a bit and I saw both of you guys there at some point or another. And I definitely enjoyed it. And I was able to do other things simultaneously, not unlike a podcast, but basically, once I joined the room, I didn't close the app, I suppose, but I turned off my phone, I locked my phone and didn't play with my phone anymore. And I don't know if that's good or bad for Clubhouse, but it was good for me from a user experience perspective, except that it wasn't very sticky, as the people like to say, in the sense that I wasn't, piddling with the phone at all or with the app at all. I was just sitting there listening. And yeah, it would have been nice to have a chat room.
This is still a thing that I have not found compelling. Even when it's people I like, even when there's never a time when I stop wishing it was a podcast in a podcast app. People keep saying, that people who say things like that are missing the point, and we're not taking advantage of the two-way nature of Clubhouse, and I think it's worth mentioning too that we're not just picking on this one particular service, but now we're also going to be picking on this category of things since everyone's copying them. First of all, I still don't want to talk on most of these. I think most people who listen don't want to talk. I think John, I think was being kind just now, talking about, the issues of how this kind of two-way communication thing scales. I think if you've ever been in a conference that had a Q&A where there's mics that are passed around, or open mics somewhere out in the auditorium, and people can come up and ask a question at certain points or make a comment, that usually is not very interesting to listen to. The only people who tend to like Q&A parts of conferences and stuff are people who want their voices to be heard, who have something to say and they want to say it. That's very different from listeners really benefiting strongly from it. And everybody can point to some Clubhouse they were in this period where it's been super hot and all these VCs and famous people are trying it out. Almost everyone can point to something and say well, look at how valuable this was because, famous or insightful person X happened to be there, and this is amazing that you have access to them, and wow, isn't that great? But the reality is that's temporary and that doesn't scale. Like, it's temporary in the sense that right now, all these like VCs and celebrities and stuff are checking this out because it's the hot new thing amongst these circles. But they're gonna move on and get bored of it too, just like they always do, because it's a big world. There's a lot of stuff that happens. So they're only going to be there for a short time. In the meantime, the floodgates are going to slowly open and flood the service with a whole bunch of people who you all don't want to hear from and who are going to be competing for everyone's attention in these rooms that you want to get into and try to make your voice heard. And so it's going to just become like more crowded, and the signal to noise ratio is going to decrease. The quality level of the average participant is going to decrease. And the whole service, I fear, is going to just turn into like this Q&A at conference kind of thing, where the two-way nature of it loses a lot of its value because most of the second way, like most of the way back, is not of high enough quality that anybody wants to hear it. And I think it would just like grind most shows to a halt. You know, I heard somebody discussing it, I forget who, comparing it to a panel discussion at a conference. I think that's apt, except panel discussions at conferences usually are the least interesting conference sessions, in my opinion. And I kind of find it to be kind of like an easy way out as a conference speaker, because you don't have to do a lot of planning compared to a full-blown like single-person talk. And there's less value there. Now imagine the panel discussion format with even less planning, and where half the session is Q&A from the audience. And I just don't see how that produces value for listeners consistently. To me, it just seems like an easy way to make a whole bunch of like bad AM talk radio show quality stuff, but at even greater scale than ever before. And that's fine. And I'm not going to say that like good stuff will never come up, where you have like, you know, good people like telling their Steve Jobs stories and whatever else. Like, that's going to occasionally happen, but that's not the norm. Even now, that's not what's usually going on there. And that's going to become even less of the norm over time as the service scales to more and more uninteresting people who just want to have their voices heard.
What happened to you being optimistic and not an old curmudgeon and not poo-pooing the new thing? Remember when you were talking about that? You seem to have turned over a new leaf with your pessimism.
Yeah, I listened to podcasts again, and it was I learned how much better they were.
So one thing I'll say to reassure you on the Q&A at a conference point, and this is going to sound bad, but I think it's actually an advantage of Clubhouse. In Clubhouse, the speakers get to pick who asks the question, and they know at least something about the people they're picking, and you can't see who they're not picking. Like, so you can't see them going, no, 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 yes. You can't see them checking what your bio says, how many followers you have, who follows you, right? And I suspect, although I don't know because I have not hosted a room, but I suspect that's a thing that you can do in Clubhouse and that people do in Clubhouse. It's not a random selection of Q&A. And even in the worst case, like the only big conferences I go to is, you know, I used to go to PAX every year a while back, and then of course I go to WWDC, and sometimes I really like the Q&As. In fact, there was one session at PAX, the entire 2-hour session was 100% Q&A. Now, granted, in like comedy type shows, getting random questions from the audience is part of the fun, but on the flip side of that, at WWDC, like, there's a reason Apple got rid of the Q&A in their sessions, mostly because they didn't want to answer hard questions about the App Store. But setting that aside, the place where Q&A still exists at WWDC is in the celebrity lunch sessions, where they have someone famous or well established in a profession or whatever come up and do a talk not about Apple stuff. And, you know, again, sometimes the Q&As there were terrible too, but sometimes they were really good, especially if it's a, you know, beloved character, as Merlin would say. Someone who the audience really loves and wants to hear things from. Every single person in line loves the person and gives them nice, respectful, hopefully interesting questions, and the audience enjoys it. So I still, my main frustration with Clubhouse now is still when someone tries to talk to me when the Clubhouse is on, I pull out one of my AirPods and the thing doesn't stop. Again, I see last week where I wished for pausing and catching up. But anyway, I'm still investigating Clubhouse. Sounds like Marco may not be investigating much longer, but, you know, not everything is for every person. There's tons of things that we all don't do. I don't think Marco plays video games and streams himself, but that is a very popular thing to do, despite the fact that Marco doesn't want to do it.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I'm not saying anything about that, but yeah, I just so far, like I like when Guru joined that room and everybody was talking about it, I saw the two of you were in, and I'm like, all right, fine, I should probably join this and see what this is about.
Wow. that particular room demonstrated an anti-pattern that happens. I don't know if it's an anti-pattern. I don't know what you can do about it. Maybe it's a feature, but it's an awkward thing that I've seen happen in Clubhouse multiple times now in my tiny experience in Clubhouse, which is someone starts a room for an intended purpose. Someone essentially more famous than them joins the room, joins the audience. They nominate them as a speaker, and then all the audience wants to do is ask questions of the person who was just nominated as a speaker. And that's nobody's fault, really, but it's a dynamic that's a little bit awkward and weird because, like, you know, if who's running the show? And I bet Clubhouse would say, well, no one's running the show. It's just a big collaborative thing that just is an emergent property of the participants. But sometimes the person who started the rooms thinks they're running the show, and then eventually they're not.
I haven't cracked this nut yet and found anything that I really thought needed to be that format, as opposed to like, wow, if this was just released as a podcast, I would enjoy this a lot more, and it would be a much easier for me to listen to it.
There should be a Fish concert because they can nominate people to play guitar from the audience, and Marco would love it. It's all just collaborative. It's different every time.
Yeah, maybe I'm just like a snob, but I mostly just want to hear the people who are good. Like I want to hear like not just like, hey, let's incorporate everyone's ideas in this discussion.
What about the Kiss guy from the Foo Fighters concert? Am I getting this right? I need Marilyn on the show to tell me if I'm getting these references right.
I don't.
Chat room, look up Kiss guy Foo Fighters. Tell me if I'm right.
I don't know. If I had a ticket to the Foo Fighters, I wouldn't want them to pick random people from the audience. I want to see Dave Grohl. That's why I'm going.
You might like Kiss guy. The whole reason this is a meme is it was some, I don't know if I'm getting the details right. Some famous band invited someone up on stage to play guitar, and the person was amazing, and the band was amazed by the fact that they were amazing. And anyway,
I mean, I'll look it up, but like that. First of all, that is probably not the common case.
I was just trying to make a Fish joke because, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a bunch of people noodling around on stage. So who cares if they bring up someone from the audience? That's all I was doing. Don't take me too seriously.
That's not it. But yeah, okay.
I know. That's why it's a joke. Okay.
Wow, that went right off the rails. Like a Clubhouse room.
Hey, no, if only. That's the thing. There's not enough overtalk in Clubhouse. That's what Clubhouse needs. More people talking at once.
Yeah. Oh God. And that's the other thing too. Like maybe this must just be really wrong for me. Because what I hear on Clubhouse sounds, in both audio quality and communication effectiveness, like a conference call. It sounds like I'm just on a conference call. I hate conference calls. I think conference calls are one of the worst communication mechanisms we've ever devised as a species. And this service basically is like, hey, jump on any conference call you want.
Can everybody hear me?
Oh, wait, no, you
Marco,
talk.
I think you're
now,
muted.
Wait, now, no, John, now you talk.
Casey, I can hear you typing. Mute yourself.
Oh, right. I was just going to say.
It's just why? Like, why?
I don't know why the two of you are complaining about conference calls. I'm on conference calls all day long. You two are not.
So you're desensitized. You don't realize how bad they are.
No, it's not. It's the opposite. It's like being on a desert island with fish. You hate it even more.
No, like usually, I am very fortunate in that usually I'm not on conference calls. So when I am on one, and our wonderful sponsors and everything almost never make me do anything like this, but occasionally somebody wants to have a call. And occasionally they can't be talked out of it. And occasionally I have to go on a conference call. And every time I'm on a conference call, I have a number of opinions. Number one is like, who are all these people on this? Why did this call have to have 7 people on it when only 1 to 2 of them are actually talking ever during the whole call? I don't even know what the 6 of these 7 people do. Their job titles seem like they don't do anything or that they are redundant.
You're missing out on the great part of the conference call where everybody has to introduce themselves and it takes half an hour.
Right, yeah, exactly. And then most of the people never talk again, so I didn't need to know that. And am I supposed to remember what your voice sounds like the whole time? No. So and then like afterwards I'm like, all right, the amount of like person hours that it cost to arrange the call, then on the call, then the follow-up email after the call, it's like it must have cost this company like $20,000. And it's like, what was that worth it? That couldn't possibly have been worth that. Like that could have just been an email. So yeah, I'm not a fan of conference calls. In case that wasn't clear.
Oh, I had no idea. I don't know. I think between the two of you guys, John, I think you have some reserved enthusiasm for it. It seems. I think mine is even more reserved, and Marco, I think that you've pretty much unequivocally decided it's not for you. And I think any of those conclusions is perfectly reasonable. But we should move along a little bit. Guy Rambo did some investigations with regard to the spewing and uploading of all of your contacts. And so he had a short Twitter thread, and I will read pretty much all of it. Guy says, I just had a poke at the Clubhouse app with a proxy given the recent concerns about contacts usage. The bad part is that it uploads all of your contacts' phone numbers. Surprise. The good part is that it's the quote-unquote only thing it uploads about them. The contacts on my test device were all fake and included several pieces of data, including email address and picture, but Clubhouse only uploaded the phone numbers. Another problem is that the API used to upload the phone numbers doesn't seem to be using SSL pinning. Also, if they just want to match people based on who they have phone numbers for and contacts, they should use one-way hashes. So that's some technical jargon to say that if there are ways in which they could do this more safely, but the good news is all they're taking is numeric phone numbers and seemingly nothing else. So it could be worse, but it's still not great.
Yeah, I mean, they have access to everything. Like the fact that they're just doing phone numbers now, unless you're going to constantly monitor what they're pulling, they could change at any time.
Yeah, I still don't see how this is anything but a privacy disaster. And by the way, probably a violation of GDPR also, because all those phone numbers that people are uploading, those people could not and did not consent to the sharing of that data. So it's got to be illegal in the EU for them to even possess this data in the first place.
Yeah, I don't know what the GDPR says about data given to other private citizens, that, you know, what happens to it there. If they give it to a company, then obviously it's different. But anyway, who knows? I'm sure they'll work it out with whatever. If this ever gets big, I'm sure they'll work it out with whatever countries they're dealing with stuff in. And by the way, on the subject of hashing, which I also brought up on a previous show, a couple of people on Twitter sent me links to some depressing demonstrations that given the limited sort of key space of email addresses, and the email addresses are constrained. They can't be unlimited length. There's certain characters that are valid. They have a particular format. One-way hashes are not quite so one-way as you might think they are when it comes to email addresses, given a little bit of time and effort, which is a bummer, but, you know, that's life.
All right, can you tell me about ephemeral Clubhouse?
Yeah, the supposed beauty and promise of Clubhouse is that, you know, it's not recorded. It's not a podcast. You had to be there. If you were there, great. If not, oh well. This shortly after we recorded the show where we mentioned these stories about Steve Jobs' Clubhouse, it was posted to YouTube because it was recorded. Obviously, I mean, there's nothing you can do to stop people from recording it. I think the Clubhouse app strongly discourages it, but computers. I'm not quite sure how this recording was made, but not only was the stories from Steve Jobs thing recorded, but it was also uploaded to the Computer History Museum site, sort of, you know, for as a historical artifact. So if you didn't get in on that Clubhouse room and want to see it, it's on YouTube. Link will be in the show notes. And related to that, there was a story in Inc. Website, Inc.com, that says with the sensational headline, Clubhouse is recording your conversations, and that's not even its worst privacy problem. A little bit sensational, but in their terms of service that nobody reads, it does say, Clubhouse says, solely for the purposes of supporting incident investigations, we temporarily record the audio in a room while the room is live. If a user reports a trust and safety violation while the room is active, we retain the audio for the purpose of investigating the incident and then delete it when the investigation is complete. If no incident is reported in a room, then we delete the temporary audio recording when the room ends. So, I mean, not that you shouldn't have already been assuming this anyway, but just because the Clubhouse app discourages you from recording it doesn't mean that they're not recording it. And you can see based, you know, like they have a thing in Clubhouse where you can report, report a recent speaker if someone comes on stage and says something bad and you want to report them. Like there's this whole sort of reputation and reporting system built into the app, which is a good thing. And to sort of adjudicate those, they have to have a recording of what went down rather than, well, they don't have to, but it's better to have a recording than to just take someone's word for it that someone did something bad or whatever. So this makes some sense, but lest you believe that Clubhouse really is completely like a wisp on the wind and it's here and it's gone, just like all those other things, whether it be Instagram stories or Snapchat or whatever, you're giving your data to the service provider and they're doing with it whatever they want. And if you're wondering what they're doing with it, you can read their 800-page terms of service and figure it out. But the bottom line is once you give it to them, they are, you know, who knows what they're doing with it. And if you're uncomfortable with your things being recorded, don't use Clubhouse. But then again, you probably also shouldn't use Instagram Stories or Snapchat or any other service that records your audio.
We are sponsored this week by Away. Whether it's a trip to the corner store, a weekend away, or an extended stay with friends and family, we're all navigating the current reality of travel. But no matter your destination or your style, Away's suitcases, bags, and accessories all come in a variety of colors, sizes, and materials to suit your needs and inspire your future travels. All of Away's suitcases are made to the highest quality. They are designed to last a lifetime with durable exteriors that can withstand even the roughest of baggage handlers. And if any part of your suitcase ever breaks, their standout customer service team will arrange to have it fixed or replaced. These have lifetime warranties. And all these suitcases are incredibly well designed on the inside too. They have an interior organization system that includes things like a built-in compression pad to help you pack more stuff, a hidden removable laundry bag to separate your dirty clothes from your clean clothes as you travel, and they all have 4 360-degree spinner wheels, so you can roll them through the airport really easily. Lots of maneuverability there, and all this is available in a nice, huge variety of materials, colors, and sizes to fit your style and your personality. This is a great line of suitcases and other travel gear at Away, and you can see for yourself by taking advantage of their 100-day trial. All of their products come with a 100-day trial. So you actually are expected to take it out traveling. Like take your new Away suitcase out on the road, live with it, travel with it, get lost with it for 100 days. And if you decide it's not for you after that, you can return any non-personalized item for a full refund, no ifs, ands, or asterisks. And they have free shipping and free returns on all orders within the contiguous US, UK, Europe, and Canada. So start your 100-day trial and shop the entire Away lineup of travel essentials, including their best-selling suitcases, at awaytravel.com/accidentaltech. That's awaytravel.com/accidentaltech. Thank you to Away for sponsoring our show.
So, John, you also defected away from Clubhouse, and you've tried Twitter Spaces?
Notice the tried is in scare quotes in this item. Mm-hmm. I tried Twitter's Clubhouse. This is like right after we finished recording the episode where Marco was saying, like, we were debating whether it was going to be a feature or be purchased, and Marco said it's going to be both. They'll be copied by everybody else, but also maybe they'll get purchased. Twitter very quickly announced a bunch of stuff that they're doing, one of which is, hey, it's like Clubhouse, but on Twitter. And basically the way I found out about this, so I don't use the official Twitter client, but occasionally in my third-party client, I come on a tweet that I can't see the features of because Twitter is evil and doesn't allow third-party clients to have access to all the features. So, for example, polls. If you see a poll, I can't see polls in my third-party Twitter client. So if I see a tweet that is a poll and I want to see it, I have to open it in the official client, right? And so occasionally I do that. And so I had done that, like there was some tweet, I don't remember if it was a poll or not, but something like that I couldn't see in my third-party Twitter client. So I hopped over to the real client, which is just a matter of saying, open in Twitter or open in browser, even with the link redirect thing. And I ended up in the official Twitter client.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it was tough. I saw a thing. I want to get out of there as fast as possible because I can't make heads or tails of that mess. And I think I wanted to either reply or compose a tweet or something. Like I wanted to do something quickly and I was already in the Twitter app. So I pressed the little like compose button or something like that. And it popped up like a constellation of 3 little circles. I don't know if I wasn't paying attention or what, but I hit one of the circles or hit something. And rather than a tweet compose screen, what happened was I was suddenly in a Twitter space. And I was the host of the Twitter space. And then apparently Twitter notified everyone who follows me, hey, John has created a Twitter space.
Oh, delightful.
Do you want to come into John's Twitter space and space with him? And then so my icon is in the little my icon's in the little Twitter space, and then another icon appears, and then another icon, and then another icon, and then another icon, and another icon. I'm pretty sure at this point my mic is live as well, like because I pressed it. So I'm in a thing, and like my mic, I think I found like the mute thing or whatever, and turned my mic off. And then I was like, because look, I didn't know what Twitter Spaces was at this point, and I'm like, what just happened? It looks so much like Clubhouse. I'm like, did I accidentally swipe over to the Clubhouse? Like, no, I'm still in the Twitter app. Like, what even is going on here? And so the room filled up, and I looked around for any other controls. What I would have done, speaking of chat room, is typed into the chat room and said, sorry, everybody, I have no idea what the heck I just pressed to make this thing happen, but I didn't do this on purpose, and now I have to go. So that's what I did. Like the room had filled with like a dozen people in like the short period of time, very short, like seconds. People had come in because I guess they got like push notifications, and then it just bailed. So if you're one of those people who came into my my Twitter space because I'm somehow in the beta, or I don't know, is this a publicly rolled out feature? I have no freaking idea. I'm sorry. I apologize for making a space, and I apologize for not saying anything and just immediately leaving. This gets to what Marco was saying before. Was it Marco saying like you have no urge to speak? Yeah. Any of these things. I also, this is going to sound weird from somebody who literally speaks into a microphone for hours every single week and then distributes it to the world. I also have no urge to speak in almost every Clubhouse thing that I'm in, and including the Twitter space that I accidentally created. I don't have any urge to speak in that scenario now, and I don't know why that is. Like Obviously, I wanted to do podcasting. I got into it, like it was a thing that I thought about doing and was excited to have the opportunity to do. But I don't know if it's a different skill set, or I just got to get in the right vibe, or I just have to try it a few times to get used to it. But so far, I'm not enthusiastic about hosting a room. I'm not particularly enthusiastic about participating in a room. I think when it comes to Clubhouse, I'm just a lurker. And when it comes to Twitter Spaces, apparently I'm an accidental activator.
Cue the theme song.
Yeah. And so Twitter is rolling out some more things that are just tangentially related. We're not going to have time to go into now, but I figure they're worth mentioning. Super follows, which I think is actually a clever name because it makes no sense but sounds neat. Super follows is where you can charge people to get access to exclusive content on Twitter, which is interesting because that means Twitter is going to have to, get people's payment methods and just, the whole deal. Right now, no one pays to use Twitter as far as I know, right?
I think that's right, unless you're advertising with them.
Yeah, I suppose. Anyway, and then you can offer them, bonus content, tweets that only they can see, a group, a newsletter. Who knows? This is not a released feature, at least not released to me. So, but it's Twitter. This was at their investor meetings to say we're going to do a thing where you can charge people to get exclusive content. So let's see how that turns out. But hey, at least Twitter is trying something. And then the final thing is communities, which is like they show in the screenshot here, groups. One group called Crazy for Cats, one group called Surf Girls, GURLZ, and Plant Parents. And I don't know what they're trying to go for here. It's like every time you look at these things, you have to squint and say, who are they trying to copy? So it's like, okay, Spaces is Clubhouse, Super Follows is Patreon, Twitter Communities is what? Like Facebook groups?
Yeah.
No. Anyway, coming soon to a Twitter client that you should never use near you.
Oh, man. Yeah, I try periodically to go to the official Twitter client just to see, what's going on there. And there are a couple things I like about it, but overwhelmingly, so much about it I really dislike. And one of the best examples is there is no sort, or I haven't found any sort of idea of state. So I do try to be a Twitter completionist for a private list that I have, and certainly for my mentions. And it seems like every time I arrive at the official Twitter client, it's just like, we're going to put you right here. I have no idea why. You don't have any idea why. I don't have any idea why, but that's where you're going to start because that sounds fun. And if they just got that right, I think it would actually be semi-tolerable. I wouldn't say it would be great, but it'd be semi-tolerable. But golly, every time I go and land there, even if that was the last, Twitter client I used, it's still like, oh yeah, we'll just put you in the middle of nowhere. Why not? And it's very, very frustrating.
Yeah, I want to make that pitch. Like I continue to be shocked every time I realize that some person I am acquainted with in my tech nerd circles uses the official Twitter client because they'll complain about something like seeing ads or some other thing in the official Twitter client. If you're listening to this extremely tech nerdy podcast and you are used Twitter at all and you are using the official Twitter client and you've never tried a third-party client, I know that's a lot of qualifiers, please check out a third-party Twitter client for iOS. There are lots of good ones to choose from. I use Twitterific and love it. Tweetbot is also very good. There are others to choose from. It's so much better if you just want a sane reverse chronological timeline of tweets in order from the people you follow, which sounds like what Twitter should always be, but hasn't been for many, many years. The official client is janky in many ways. I know you can turn off the algorithmic timeline if you are persistent, but in a third-party client, you don't get ads unless they're ads from the third-party client itself, which you can usually pay to get rid of. And if you can't use a different third-party client where you can, it's just so much nicer experience. Like I think very often that if I couldn't use a third-party client, would I still use Twitter? I would use it a lot less, or I would like it a lot less. So if you've never tried it, give a third-party client a try.
That actually is, I think, the best reason to use the main client is if you want to use Twitter less.
It encourages you to use it less because it stinks.
It does, because it is, it's so like weird to use the main client.
You might end up in a space.
It's really, it's quote good. It's good if what you want to do is be a very light Twitter user, a very casual Twitter user where you just like dip in occasionally, look at some random crap, and then dip out. It's good for that. That's pretty much all it's good for. And so if that's what you're going for, if you're like currently like super addicted to Twitter and you're trying to like reduce maybe being a completionist or something else, then by all means delete every other Twitter app on your phone and just use the main app, because it will force you into the habit of using Twitter less because it is so bad at being a power user app.
Speaking of that, can you both launch the official Twitter app right now and long press on the compose tweet button?
I did that earlier. Yeah, so I get three options. I get there are three icons. And this is very reminiscent of, Path that did this like radial thing way back in the day, which is a really beautiful social network, even though it was otherwise useless. There's three lines with a quill, which I believe means make a new text tweet. There's a box with GIF in the center that presumably means, make a tweet with an animated GIF. And then there's like a box with a landscape in it. And I presume that means, open your photos and tweet a photo. And that's all I have.
Marco?
I don't have it installed. I'm not going to install for this.
All right, anyway, I've got the same first two buttons as Casey, but my third button is a diamond made out of dots, and that's the spaces thing. So I just wanted to see if it was rolled out for everybody, or if I'm just a lucky person. But
so instead of the upload a photo, you have the diamond hands?
A diamond made out of dots, which honestly, even if I had looked at, I would have had no idea what that was going to do.
There's a part of me that wants to just use the official Twitter client and live the way the regular people do, and then I use it for 10 minutes and I'm just like, oh god, it's intolerable.
No, regular people shouldn't live that way. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think people. That's why I made the point to say it on the podcast, because like for regular people, maybe they don't care, but like it's so much better than the other than the official client if you just want. Like imagine if when you looked in your email inbox, it just gave you like a random selection of your emails algorithmically chosen. You'd be like, but I just show me all the emails I got in chronological order. I'll go through them, right? I don't just try to guess at what I want to see. Like if that is how you want to interact with Twitter, to Marco's point, maybe you don't. Maybe you just want it to be like, oh, show me some popular stuff and then I'll bail. But if you want to interact with it like you interact with RSS or email, a third-party Twitter client. And even if you don't, even if you like the algorithm timeline, just to get rid of ads. Like, and yeah, I know he's like, oh, you didn't just say you can't use polls and stuff? Trust me, you're not missing much. Most Twitter polls stink. And you can always go over to it's the worst. You can't even see the results unless you vote. That's why everyone has to put the just show me the results thing. And they limit the number of choices. I tried to do a Twitter poll like sometime this past year, and I was so angry that I couldn't put all my options in because there was a limit. It's like 5 options or something, and I had 6 for my joke poll. And I'm like, oh, well, you just ruined my joke. Nice thing. 5 options, whatever the hell it is. I mean, I'm not saying there should be 1,000, but it should be more than like a handful.
We are sponsored this week by Linode, my favorite place to run servers. Whether you are working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, you deserve simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing solutions that allow you to take your project to the next level. Simplify your cloud infrastructure with Linode's Linux virtual machines. You can develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Get started today with $100 in free credit at linode.com/ATP or text ATP to 474747 for that instant access to $100 in free credit. Linode is a great web host. I think I currently host something like 28 servers there. I've been with them for a long time, long before they were a sponsor. And they're a great host. They have amazing value. You know, if you compare the resource levels and stuff that you get from them compared to anybody else in the business, and I don't think I've ever seen anybody who can consistently beat them. It's just really, it's a great value for what you pay, for what you get. And it's just really great even at any price. Like I love their control panel. I love their capabilities. They have 11 data centers you can stick your servers in. They have all different kinds of server capabilities and optimizations for different tasks if you need. They have all sorts of managed additional services like their new S3 compatible object storage. They have managed Kubernetes support, and there's so much more at Linode. Great support if you ever need it. I needed it recently, and they're just wonderful. Super easy to deal with, and the people that you talk to are like the right people. There's never any kind of tiers or handoffs to like higher level service. It's just like you're always talking to the right people. It's great. Visit linode.com/ATP and click that Create Free Account button to get started, or text ATP to 474747. Get started on Linode today. Thank you to Linode for hosting all my servers and sponsoring our show.
So speaking of official clients that are meh and third-party apps that are way better, Overcast 2021.1 is out.
Doesn't just roll off the tongue, does it?
Nope.
You got to give cool code names for your releases. This is the Watch Me Now release. I don't know. Come up with something.
Well done. I really like. I think I first saw this from Curtis Herbert and Slopes, and then Marco adopted it shortly thereafter. But I do like this kind of year and then increment version scheme, which is what I've used for my apps. But no, it does not roll off the tongue at all.
No. Yeah, and I think I might kind of regret this versioning scheme just because it's so clumsy.
You got version inflation. You can't go back now.
And you literally can't. Like, Apple does not allow you to ship a version to the App Store that is like numerically less than the one you shipped last.
Can you use scientific notation? 9E5.
Yeah, I feel like I should just do, version like, all right, 5000.1, 5000.2.
You could put an exclamation point and then it'll treat it as factorial.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh, well. That's like all the fields in Photoshop where you can put in math expressions and it will just expand them for you. I don't think Photoshop understands factorial. Now I just want to go test that.
Tell us about this, Marco.
The main changes in this version of Overcast are under the hood stuff that nobody even sees. And then secondly, the entire watch app. The main goal of this was, number one, modernize a lot of the guts of the app, a lot of the like data layer, the network layer, all that stuff, because it was all 7-year-old code, most of which is still there, but modernize it to the point where both it could be optimized to whatever it needs to be for modern day, but also the driving factor behind it was I wanted to rewrite the watch app to have the same sync engine and all the model and data layers and stuff as the main app, because the watch app was miserably bad at being reliable and at sync and everything else. It was to the point where I knew phone to watch communication is so unreliable with the watch connectivity framework and everything. It's so unreliable. I knew the key to happiness here is to have the watch be a first-class sync client that syncs directly to the Overcast web service and runs all the sync stuff itself and only communicates to the phone when it comes time to use the watch as a remote for the phone app, which is a common use, granted, probably even the most common use. But that should be the only communication it does. The phone telling it what's playing on the phone, the watch telling the phone hey, the user just hit pause the audio, whatever, that kind of thing. But not using the phone app and that communication channel as this way to sync all the data to the watch and all the podcast files for people who are wanting to listen to stuff directly on the watch without their phone present, if they're going on a run or whatever. I knew I had to bring the sync engine over to the watch. In order to do this, there were two major undertakings. Number one, the watch does not run UIKit. And for the time being, at least, the watch does not run my audio processing engine. And so all the places in the sync engine and in the model layers, all the places where that code was intertwined with UIKit or with the audio engine had to be broken up and made more orthogonal. So I couldn't have a little clause in the sync engine that says, oh, well, if this is synced this way, or if this condition happens in the model layer, go tell the audio engine to do this, or fire this UI notification directly to the UI of the app. I had to break those bonds, make the code more isolated, more orthogonal, more independent from the other components of the app, so that the sync and model layer could sync itself without any UIKit code, without any tying in with the phone app in ways that I couldn't bring over the watch app. Part 2 was simply making it more efficient. Because to run the sync engine and everything, to run that whole thing, the whole data engine on the watch, well, the watch has a way slower processor, way less RAM, way less storage space, and you are allowed to use way less of those resources before your app gets killed. Background operation on the watch is very limited. If you use, I think, 2 seconds of CPU time, your app gets killed.
Oy.
And again, memory is constrained. So it's a much more constrained environment for resources and for what apps are allowed to do and when. So I had to make everything, efficient. And it was already pretty close, but it took some work. And then finally, I wanted to rewrite the watch app in Swift UI for lots of reasons. I mean, WatchKit is the worst. And Swift UI, while it has many challenges to it, is a hell of a lot better than WatchKit in so many ways. It's not even close. So, I was willing to tolerate the pain of learning Swift UI and all the weird walls you hit when using Swift UI compared to the immense pain I knew from WatchKit. That last challenge was to adapt or rewrite parts of my almost entirely Objective-C data layer to be easily integrated into Swift UI, which involves, in many cases, just rewriting certain classes in Swift. Things like the download manager, the sync queue for sync operations, like for how those are scheduled, stuff like that, so that they could then tell the UI things like whether sync is in progress, what the download state is of an episode. It's things like that. It's much, much, much easier and better to have a lot of that stuff be in Swift classes. And so making the data layer integrate better or at all with Swift UI required a lot of rewriting stuff in Swift or writing shims on top of things in Swift. So that was the main challenge of this version, is over the last few, I think about 3 or 4 months or so, rewriting core components in Swift when necessary, bridging things to Swift and making things more Swift friendly when I wasn't rewriting them, and then making all the code like for sync and everything standalone from the rest of the iOS app so that it could be built and run on the watch, and making that efficient enough that I didn't get killed constantly. That's what this update was. And what users saw was basically like bug fixes and new watch app. That's like, this massive amount of work, massive amounts of change, all of that to basically say like bug fixes and the watch app is all new. But those, that's the kind of thing that it really needed. And the watch app was in a really bad state before this. It really didn't work well for a lot of people. And so I had to really tackle that. And this allowed me to do a bunch of other stuff. Like there was a whole thing about, I did rewrite all the intent handling. Adopting the new intent handling required me to switch my old UI app delegate thing to UI scene delegate, the scene delegate API that was launched a few years ago. And I decided, well, I might as well do that in Swift as well. And then I might as well, rewrite my app delegate. Since I have to rewrite it anyway, I might as well rewrite the app delegate in Swift. And as any iOS developer can tell you, rewriting your app delegate after a 7-year code base can be terrifying and quite an ordeal. So it's just like there was tons of stuff like that where in order to do some modern thing, I had to either rewrite something from scratch or at least significantly change it to use a new API. And so it just took a lot of time. There was a lot of code modernization to do, a lot of rewriting or refactoring or shimming to do. I still haven't even gotten to all of it. Like, part of the reason I was doing all this was to prepare myself to do iOS 14 widgets, which I still, frankly, don't really want as a user. Like, for a podcast app, I don't really think it's going to work the way people think it will. But my customers are demanding that in moderate numbers, and so I figured I should probably do it. But even to do that, I had to lay all this groundwork. There's a bunch of changes to CarPlay's abilities in iOS 14 that this version does not tackle yet, but because I just didn't have time. But that's going to be something I tackle next, and I think a lot of this groundwork is going to help that become easier or possible.
Wait, so slow down. what is it that CarPlay can do now that it couldn't before, for your perspective?
Again, I haven't looked too far into this yet. Again, I just haven't had time. But I think you're able to have a lot more control over the types of UI that you can display than previously. Before, the CarPlay interface I have now is built on this older API where you basically responded to Apple asking for a tree structure. So it would say, all right, we're on the root screen. What are the list elements of the root screen? Give me the list items. And then it would say, all right, person tapped in this item. Give me the list elements in the next level of the tree or whatever. It was a very, very simple like list based thing. And then the now playing screen, I had almost no control over. The new CarPlay API adds some ways, and again, I don't know to the extent yet how much, but it adds more places where you can customize what the UI actually is, including on the now playing screen, which is very important to me because I really want to be able to tackle that in a good way. And so my next major update, I intend to have widgets and CarPlay redo basically, but that's probably a few months out still.
It's a feature request from the chat room for chapter skip and chapter control and display on the now playing screen.
Yeah, on CarPlay, yeah, that's certainly on my list. I don't know to what degree that's possible yet. Like it's always been frustrating with CarPlay because, like in the previous one, the one that my current app is based on, you could offer speed control, but if you did, like you would have to say, all right, here's the list of speeds I support, and then the only way the user could go through them would be like tap the speed icon on the screen, and it would then, for every tap, it would go to the next speed. And so you'd have to, like, if you wanted to slow it down by one, you have to tap through every single...
You have to go through Chipmunk.
Yeah, you have to go through every single other speed first. It was just a terrible experience. Like, I tried. I did it in beta once. I tried to actually use it that way, and it was miserable. And so I didn't even ship the speed feature, even though I could have easily. I disabled it because the experience was so bad. So with this new CarPlay API, I believe we're able to do better things like that. So things like having a better speed picker or having a chapter list and chapter picker, I think will become possible with this new API. But until I actually try it, I won't know A, whether I can do it, and then B, whether it's shippable or not.
So Casey and I have quotas based on our union membership, and we have to point out that if you did have any kind of automated testing, that work you did to divorce your sync engine from your UI probably wouldn't have happened because you would have already had them separated just so you could easily test the sync engine before you wrote the UI. Just saying.
Not only that, but since we're beating on Marco now, one of the advantages of having any sort of automated testing is that when you do utterly destructive things like destroy your app delegate and move to a scene delegate, not all of that, and maybe even not a ton of it, could have been covered by automated tests, but presumably more than zero could have been. And one of the things that I love most about when I do have good test coverage, and do as I say, not as I do, I paint this picture like I unit test everything, and I don't, very far from it. But when you do have good unit test coverage, what's nice is you can break something in terms of the quote unquote real part of your code, and then just run your unit tests to make sure they still pass. And if they do, you have some amount of confidence, certainly more than zero, that everything should still work the way it's supposed to. And that doesn't replace all the human testing that I'm quite confident Marco did, because I didn't have any particularly major issues with this update. But nevertheless, it does give you some amount of confidence and some amount of flexibility. And I guess a parachute, over you, behind you, whatever, when you're making these sweeping changes like you did.
I wanted to also address one more thing quickly. Underscore my name is T in the chat is talking about how I didn't mention the audio engine for the Watch app. So when I was writing Voice Boost 2 last year, I specifically wrote it to be like ruthlessly, incredibly efficient with the idea that I want to bring it to the Watch. And I rewrote not only the Voice Boost 2 component and therefore the smart speed implementation within it, but also the surrounding audio API. At that time, I also switched from the old deprecated AU Graph API to the new currently supported AV Audio Engine, which has actually lots of problems, but I figured ways around them. And part of when I did that, I intentionally stuck with APIs that were available on the Watch as well. So I have laid almost all of the groundwork to port my audio engine to the Watch as well. The only thing I couldn't get to be available on the Watch in a way I could use on the phone or at all is to have speed control. Not smart speed, but just like plain old, like play this at 1x or 1.5x or whatever. That is not a public API on the watch in a way that you can use in AV Audio Engine. The only way that's exposed on the watch in public usable APIs is if you make like an AV player or something, but those APIs don't give you the flexibility to process the audio the way my audio engine does. So if I want to run an audio engine with processing on the watch, I have to either not offer speed up, which no, or I have to write my own speed up, which I've never, all the audio processing I've done before, I've never written a speed up algorithm. I intend to tackle that at some point just to try to see if I can do it to an acceptable level of quality. I assume that what the Apple like version of it is doing is like a PSOLA kind of algorithm or TSOLA. It's like I've looked at like what these algorithms are, and I think I could do it slightly reasonably in a way that would be good enough quality for speech on the watch. But it just, that's what's holding me back there, is that I can't yet find a way to offer speed ups on the watch without in an API where I can process the audio in other ways as well, without writing my own speed up algorithm, which is just a job I haven't tackled yet.
Maybe you should just like change the icon or finally get rid of the custom font just so people could be in an uproar about your new version.
Honestly, I am very, very close to dropping the custom font for whatever I do for the like UI redesign that I've been thinking and brainstorming about for 5 years. Haven't done yet.
Then it would be a big change. I remember being indignant that everyone complained that the iPhone 4S wasn't a big upgrade because it looked the same on the outside, and that is the eternal curse of people with GUI apps that don't change the GUI. People think nothing changed. Mm-hmm. That's life.
No, and the reality is, my customers are really good. I haven't gotten a lot of crap from anybody about this. Like there was one, I think, or two negative reviews somewhere. I forget whether it was App Store or what, but a few people complaining before I had released this that I hadn't updated the app in like 7 months. And that's not actually true. It had been about 3 months, but the last version number was 2020.8, which somebody might interpret as August, even though it was actually in like November. And so that is actually a problem with this version number scheme, that it kind of looks like year.month.
I thought it was year.month.
and it just so happened that during most of 2020, like during the first half of 2020, I released about one version a month. Mm-hmm. And so for the first half of the year, it matched up pretty well to the month. But no, it's not. It's just sequential numbering. It's just whenever it's ready, I ship that version. Like, what if I wanted to ship 2 versions in a month? Like,
I think I was on a patch version a day with front and center for the first few weeks that it was out. So I wonder if people thought the last number was the day I released it.
Right. So yeah, so that is definitely one problem with date-based versioning, is that it sure looks like it's date month instead of just or year month instead of just year. But anyway, at some point I do intend to do like a larger UI redesign, and I've decided throughout all of this, I'm going to start tackling that when I can require iOS 14, and that way I can use a lot more Swift UI stuff and a few other niceties. And realistically, I could require iOS 14 now, but it's not a super great idea if you don't have to yet. And so again, a UI redesign is definitely on my list of things to do, but because it's not like super pressing, and there's lots of other stuff that is more pressing, it just keeps not getting done. And it might be another year or two before I even tackle it, because now that I've spent 4 months or whatever it's been on like under the hood stuff and a very small number of new features, but mostly just under the hood stuff, what I want to do next is features. Like people have been asking for certain features for a long time, so I want to tackle that next, as opposed to a massive UI redesign, which, I mean, it's a podcast app. The UI doesn't matter that much, and the reality is features matter more to my customers at this point. And so a UI redesign is more like self-serving. I want to do it because I want to do it, but what my customers want is features, and so I want to work on that for a little while first.
So you've opened the floodgates for feature requests. Time for my semi-annual Overcast feature requests. I have 2 of them, one easy, one hard.
Catch-up mode?
No, I'm not going to go into all that stuff.
I do want to do that, by the way. I actually wrote server-side support for catch-up mode, but it's kind of buggy. The function on the server that handles what episodes in a podcast should be shown to you as new is incredibly finicky and incredibly high stakes. If I screw that up, the servers explode, basically, because it's just massive amounts of volume going through that function and massive, and it's dealing with the biggest database table in the app by a long shot, which is the table of like it's the progress of a user within a certain episode. That table is massive, and it's highly optimized. And if anything goes wrong with that table, or with the function that determines what to write to that table, and more importantly, when not to write to that table, things go very badly. And so I haven't wanted to tackle that yet, because last time I tried tackling it, I blew up the servers. It sucked for a few days. I eventually was able to roll it back, and I'm like, I don't want to touch it. I'd rather not touch that area of the app, because to touch it for this like relatively low needs feature is a very, very high risk. And so I'd rather not do it, but someday I'll get there.
Well, since you brought up that feature, my suggestion for how to deal with that is not to screw up the table you were just describing, but to essentially be able to mark a podcast as participating in the special mode, and then have your own separate table that is only for podcasts marked in this mode. I know it's annoying to fork the code and say, okay, well, if one of these podcasts do this, but if one of these podcasts do this, and now I got to do everything twice. But it will totally save you from hosing your very precious table, because like you said, this is a small feature. They can have their own set of tables with their own purpose for tracking their own metadata just for these kind of podcasts in this weird ass mode that you can call time shifting mode, and generalize and try to make it so they can support other features. But I agree that it's probably not a good idea to take a feature that almost no one will use and compromise the entire design of your app and your biggest, scariest table for it. But that's not what I was going to ask about. I asked about easy features, because they have a chance to be implemented. Number one, when sending a clip from Overcast, very often I want to send a clip that is below the minimum size the UI will let me squish those two little endpoints together. And there's plenty more room to squish them, and I want to crushing their head. I want to get that thing back together. So whatever the limit is now, it's like, what, 10 seconds, 5 seconds?
I don't even know. I've never thought of sending a 5-second clip.
It's like a centimeter. It's always when I want to clip out someone pronouncing a word weird, right? And I just want to get the word and not the thing surrounding it. Whatever the limit now is, it's like a centimeter between those two endpoints, and you could definitely squish them farther than that. So that seems like an easy one to do. Throw that one in there. The harder one to do is when I'm making my beautiful hand-tailored Overcast clips, I often want to zoom in for more accurate scrubbing of placing the endpoints, instead of rolling my fat meat finger and just sort of like twisting it a little bit and then trying to release it from the screen. Oh, but no, it moved after I picked it up, and then trying again. Oh, no, it moved.
Well, because you're trying to make a 1-second clip.
I know, just say it's a minute-long clip. I'm just trying to get the endpoint exactly where I want it, and sometimes the whatever your default zoom, the granularity doesn't let me get, like, because when people have words that are strung together very quickly, I just want to slice right in between the words, and I can't get the thing on the right pixel. I know what I'm asking you is this is the hard one, is to slowly make a tiny audio editor inside Overcast, but you want to make an audio editor anyway, so might as well work on this now. Some kind of pinch to zoom feature for the timeline, so I can get more accurate. So the easy one, smaller minimum size. The hard one, zoom, maybe just 2-step zoom in, zoom out, 2 levels. Like, start with that.
Yeah, the whole feature of clip sharing, I would like to give some attention to. Here's the challenge there. So the automatic kicking machine is still necessary, and the need for it seems to slowly be getting higher. I hate this.
I noticed that.
Yes.
I notice I watch it every time. It's like, it's actually a form of entertainment. Like, is it going to do it the first time this time? No, it's not.
And part of the reason it would be hard for me to increase the granularity of the scrummers, in part because what the automatic kicking machine does. So for listeners, in case you have forgotten, this is the thing in the Overcast clip exporter, where the API that generates the like AV rendering of, like, I feed it like an animation basically, and then it generates a video file from that, like an M4V file from that. That API just occasionally hangs. I think it's AV asset exporter or something like that. It just occasionally hangs for no visible reason, and it just will hang forever. And the solution, a way to get around it is to just detect when it's just not progressing anymore, and just cancel that job and start a new one with very slightly different input and see if that works. And so what I do, I called that a while back the automatic kicking machine. And what I do is every time that it stalls and it restarts the job, it subtly tweaks the starting and ending timestamp by some tiny random amounts. So it's not enough that you would really notice it, but if I start letting you do very granular starting and endpoint or start point and endpoint editing, you might actually start to notice that. So I don't love that, but
I mean, if it's small enough that we won't notice it, we won't notice it no matter what. Like, I know what you're saying, that it would be a larger, like if you so carefully placed it, now I'm perturbing your place. You're perturbing my placement now anyway, right?
Sure.
And all I want to do is get closer to, like, presumably your random thing is sort of oscillating around the point that was selected, and I'm fine with that. If that's what you got to do for the stupid kicking machine, I'm fine. I just want a little bit more granularity on that.
Right. And so part number 2 of this comment is ultimately I want to rewrite the clip sharing implementation to use a whole different method of generating the video to avoid the need for this at all. That whole AV asset exporter thing where, like, so right now I'm basically generating a core animation set of layers. And I say, all right, go, between points, 0 and 1 in the animation, make the progress bar go from here to here. At points 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, make the timestamps this, and this, and then overlay this audio in the background under it. I'm able to then pass that to the AV asset exporter, and it generates the video for me. What I want to switch to is a much more complicated way of doing it, where I have to generate every frame as an image and pass it to some other API, using all these like different low-level APIs. But the reason I want to do that is, first of all, I want to get rid of the automatic kicking machine. Second of all, I want to redo the visual layout of what's being generated to include some kind of like more dynamic animations, like a waveform animation, and I want to try putting in editable transcriptions from the iOS transcription API. When I wrote the feature, I don't think there was an offline running version of the transcription engine, but now there is, like in iOS 14 at least, there is. And so I would like to rewrite that feature to have it be more visually interesting when people see a clip without their sound on, which is becoming more and more of a thing on social networks. So I want to have some kind of text be able to roll by, possibly even use the text in the editing view, depending on how that API works, how well it works.
Yeah, you got to let people fix mistranslations now. That's the key part of that.
Sure, yeah, and that's why it might not end up being very worth it in the output video, but it could definitely be worth it in the editor. So anyway, I want to play with that. But so the point is, I want to do these things that are basically rewriting massive parts of what clip sharing is. However, here's the problem. Almost nobody uses it.
Oh, really?
But the people who do use it are both promoting your app and also promoting podcasts. So I think it punches above its weight in terms of a feature. Like, you don't necessarily need everyone to use it, but every person who does use it is sending out into the world a thing they enjoyed from a podcast and an Overcast logo. And what I was thinking of is the main feature that I would love to see on clips, which I know you probably can't add, but it's always worth just looking into it again, is I always just want to tap on them and get taken to an Overcast link to the rest of the episode, like basically URLs. Like, if you share them on Twitter, there may be some way to hack that in. I know when I do something in Overcast, don't you have that feature for like chapter art? You can tap on it and it takes you somewhere? Or am I misremembering?
The art? Well, I mean, chapters can have links, but no, I mean, the problem that you're talking about now, though, is a problem like just in the sharing context. I'm already putting 2 items on the pasteboard. Like, I'm putting the video and a link, but most apps don't do anything with that. Most apps just take the video. And so like I'm already supplying the data in the only way that I don't know how to, or the only way I'm able to in this context, but most apps don't make it clickable.
I was thinking like in a QuickTime world where you'd have multiple tracks, and one of the tracks would be like a URL track that a savvy client would understand that is a link. You're right. It's just like, I'm thinking of it from sharing purposes, and you're right that most things that you share on, no matter what you did, they would just say, just give me the video and I'm going to show it. But that's what I really want out of sharing. Like, when you share a blog post, people tap on the link and get the full blog post. When I share a podcast, I always want to be able to, I love the fact that it's a clip, that they don't have to do anything. Here it is. Here's the clip and you're listening. And I love the fact that it's a movie. See that past episode where we discussed this. Just the one missing piece is sometimes people ask me, hey, what podcast is that from? Despite the fact that the name of the podcast and the logo of the podcast is in the video, they don't have any way to find it except for going to Google and typing in like Accidental Tech Podcast, and hopefully then what episode was it? Oh, I see the episode number, and then they have to go through the site, right? You have all that info right there. You have Overcast timestamp URLs all ready to go. It's just a question of how to get them out of your app and into the wider world. Because the reason I use the clips feature as much as I do, which is not that much, but still some, is I love to be able to share fun parts of podcasts. Granted, half of my clips that I send are, to just friends through messages when someone we know said something funny on a podcast. But I do send them on Twitter as well. Here's this clip from this thing, or check out this part of this episode, or whatever. Or I use them as snarky comebacks when people complain about something on a podcast that I was on, and then I send them a clip addressing whatever their point was, and then I don't have to reply to them on Twitter. It's like audio replies, but canned. So I like the feature. I think it is super useful for Overcast to have. And not only that, but I see tons of similar features from people who use other podcast clients, including ones with transcription on them. So maybe they have the same problem that you do, that most people don't use them, but there's enough that I see them, and there's enough that I know other people have transcription. So I feel like it's kind of table stakes at this point.
So to give you some idea of how many people use this feature.
Oh no, don't tell me, because I agree with John. I love this. Even though I don't use it that often, I love it.
I mean, I think Overcast's problem is that it's not particularly discoverable, and I think we talked about that when the feature first rolled out. But yeah,
I mean, that's not really helping, but it's in the share menu.
But no one knows what the share menu is, and it's so small.
Well, but the share menu is used, by a decent amount of people, and the shares of just links that aren't clips are about 5 times higher than clip shares. Clip sharing is used by about 1/3 as many people as the screen reader VoiceOver, about 1/10 the people as people who use the website player while logged in, and it is used by about 1/4 of as many people as who are using the Mac app on an M1 Mac.
My goodness.
So it's not a large portion of the user base. And so, if it's something like supporting VoiceOver is almost no work at all, which is why I'm embarrassed whenever I mess it up. But clip sharing is a ton of work to do that feature justice. And I already have a version of it now that works okay. And to make it better, I have to rewrite it, basically. And so it would be a large amount of work to make this feature better that almost no one uses. And I think it would be probably not time well spent. That doesn't mean I won't do it. I do things all the time that are time poorly spent just because I want them to be done. And so I will probably do this at some point, but it's not going to be a high priority.
Yeah, I would give it more visibility, because I feel like it's maybe it's just me in the circle we travel in, but I see a lot of clips shared, not just from Overcast, like I said, from other podcast apps. So someone's sharing clips from somewhere, and if people aren't doing it from Overcast that much, maybe it's because it doesn't occur to people to do it or whatever. And granted, the editing interface is weird, and I understand all the reasons why it would be a narrow thing, but I think it's free advertising for your app, and it is advertising for podcasts in general. But anyway, if you bail on all that, just make the minimum size smaller. It's really easy to change a number.
Well, I'm excited this shipped, and I think it certainly seems to be well received. I've enjoyed it. I haven't yet gone on a run with just my watch, but the watch app certainly visually seems to be way, way, way better. So all good things. I have one final question for you, though. If you were stranded on a desert island and could only bring Swift or Objective-C, what do you bring in these days? And I say that obviously to be funny, but you talked a lot about having been porting a lot to Swift, and you've kind of made references to that in the past couple of months. Do you feel like your default state is now Swift, or do you still think that you're reaching for Objective-C first and Swift only in certain circumstances?
During this version is when I crossed over. I don't know exactly when, but it was during this version that I have now crossed over to the point where not only do I write more Swift than not, and not only has it become my default, but I've actually started to prefer it.
What do you either like about Swift that's making you prefer it, or perhaps now you dislike it about Objective-C? Can you build on that anymore? To quote a underscore, let's pull on that thread a little bit.
Yeah, unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, unpack that. There you go. Sorry, I got it wrong. You're right. We'll fix it in post. That's what we'll do.
It's hard to pin it down. I mean, some of it is just syntactic and API differences. Just small stuff where like I could save a bunch of keystrokes doing this. That's a lot of it, if I'm honest. Some of it is some of the niceties that are afforded by the type system. Things like dealing with enums and stuff like that.
Enums, please, everyone, let's agree.
But you enumerate things.
I know, but we're gonna have to go through a car and char again. It's not the
which one do you prefer? Is it car or char?
I say char. Yeah.
Yeah. Then you don't say characters.
All right. I'll enumerate my characters.
Anyway, Swift enums are great. I agree there.
Swift enums are freaking amazing. Still to this day might be one of my favorite features of the language.
I mean, that's just to bring Destiny into this, because I always must do. This is what they call in Destiny and in the gaming world in general. Like when they do releases for games, that things like there are bug fixes and there are new features and there's new content. And the things Marco is talking about so far are what they call in the gaming world quality of life improvements. Like, it's easier to get to your inventory screen, and you can delete these items in sets of 5 instead of individually. And, things that don't really affect gameplay, but affect things that you do every day. Sort of the drudgery, the chores of whatever task you're trying to accomplish, and just making them easier. Even just something as simple as, how do I define a class and a bunch of attributes? Doing that in Swift involves so much less typing and so much less navigating in your UI and so much less thinking than in Objective-C. Even if you know how to do the Objective-C version like the back of your hand, like it's totally instinctive, there's just mechanically more to do than to do the same job in Swift. And I feel like enums in Swift are the same deal. You don't need that feature. You can do the same thing with a bunch of pound defines or constants or static variables or all the other tools that are available to you in Objective-C. But Swift has this one tool to do it, and it's incredibly powerful and doesn't involve a lot of typing. It's a quality of life improvement. And that's setting aside the safety stuff of like all the different safety things, just setting all that aside, but forgetting about reducing bugs or whatever, just the process of typing the code.
Yeah, like that to me is where I'm seeing much of the benefit is things, not only like little time savers from just, shorter names of everything and stuff like that, but like things like what you said about making classes or making types or making protocols, where not only is it less typing in Swift, but because it is just so much simpler and faster to do, I do it more, and that it changes the way I code, it changes the way I structure things in certain ways, and it makes certain things a lot easier or better, or it enables change to happen faster, or it enables me to know that something is correct faster. One thing I don't do much is the kind of like prefixless lifestyle. I still name my stuff beginning with OC, and I'll tell you why. It's not because I'm like, being stubborn and bucking the trend or whatever. It's because I search my code. I do Command-Shift-F to find global all the time. And if a class has a generic name without a prefix, without my little OC prefix on the front of it, it's harder for me to find references to it.
But the other classes won't be in your code when you do Command-Shift-F. They're in frameworks, and you're not searching them when you do Command-Shift-F.
No, I know, but like it's kind of like the common, or I think the preferred style right now for like writing new Swift code and SwiftUI code is to not prefix stuff with your own prefix. It's to make everything just generic name, like playlist, whatever. Like if my object was called playlist instead of OC playlist, and I did a string search for playlist in my entire app, I'm going to get so many things that aren't OC playlist commands and objects. And there's just certain times when like I use that all the time, and so I find it very, very nice to search for that. And frankly, I think dropping all the prefixes from all the APIs might be a mistake for lots of other reasons, like even the framework APIs, because it makes it harder to like search Google and Stack Overflow for things like that too. It makes it so much harder to disambiguate, like, am I talking about like a list, or am I talking about like, an NS list or whatever? I know that's not really a thing, but like I miss having those like 2-letter prefixes on things because it makes it easier for me to find in my code base. And I know you can do more structured searches for, things like find call hierarchy and stuff like that, but doing just a basic text search is so much faster and easier, and I do it all the time. And to not have named prefix, or to not have prefix names, makes that harder and makes it less effective.
So there's two aspects of that. One is just the cultural one, which you said is like the culture now in Swift is not to do that, whereas in Objective-C it was to do that. When I wrote my first Swift app for the Mac, I put, first I wasn't even thinking about it and just typing, but then eventually I realized, I should probably prefix all of these because I was in the Objective-C mindset. So I did FNC for front and center, right? FNC, whatever was the class names. Because I am a strong proponent, let's say, of namespaces in other languages. But my first problem was I had no idea how namespaces worked in Swift. So I was like, do I need to do this? Is something not going to work? Better safe than sorry. FNC in front of all my classes. But eventually I learned that is not in the culture and not strictly necessary according to what everyone else was doing. So for my second app, Switch Class, I didn't do that, the prefixes. And I have to say I aesthetically prefer not having the prefixes. I understand what you're saying about the search stuff, and I think I'm probably benefiting in my searching when I search for things for like the NS prefix, sort of getting me out of... I'm sure that I'm going to get a result that has to do with programming if I type NS string, whereas if I type just string by itself, it's harder. But I have found that adding the word Swift or the framework name like Swift UI as a search term in Google, and then type it. If you type Swift string, Google kind of figures it out. Within the project, I haven't found it to be that much of a problem. That said, I still don't know how Swift namespacing works, by the way. I would like to know, but apparently not enough for me to look it up. Right? But I have to say that when I wrote Switch Class, totally unprefixed, I ran into a namespacing issue. For exactly the reason that Marco said. If you name things in a generic way, I think I made a tweet about this, like the incredible guts that it took for Swift UI to call one of its classes View. It's just called View. Like, oh, really, View? You're just going to take that name? But of course, it's not like they're taking it forever. It is my vague understanding that it is namespaced underneath Swift UI, blah, blah, blah. But in Switch Class, as you can imagine, I have things in the code that represent the apps that appear in the palette, and I called them app. And that seems fine until I ran into some weird thing with the Swift UI previewer and Xcode where they used the same symbol app and it was conflicting with mine, and I had to qualify mine. I had I had a place in my code that just said app that runs perfectly fine in the running app, but in the preview it was flipping out and I could not figure out what it was, and then I changed it to switchglass.app and suddenly my thing worked in the preview, and I'm like, all right, well, someone needs to have a sit down and talk about what are we doing with namespaces here in Swift? Because I thought it was perfectly safe for me to call my stuff app, but apparently that is not true. And now I'm a little bit angry and I don't know what to do. Anyway, someday I'll learn how namespacing works in Swift.
So this is one of those moments where I know I'm just inviting a bunch of follow-up, but my limited understanding of namespacing in Swift is that basically each module is its own namespace. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, there's really no concept of namespacing. The closest you can do is have an enumeration that has no cases in it. So you have an enumeration that's just like functions and properties and things of that nature. And that sort of kind of gets you there. But it's not like, say, C# or something like that, where you can explicitly define a namespace. And I miss that, and I wish it was there. And I think that was an error in early Swift to not have more explicit namespacing. I've run into this from time to time because Combine has a print method that is designed to be used as a debugging tool within the context of a chain, a publisher chain, and sometimes I'll try to do a generic Swift print, and it'll be like, no, you're not giving it the right parameters, and so on and so forth. And I'm like, wait, what? Why is print Oh, right. Swift.print is what I want in this particular context, and it is very frustrating. So I totally hear you.
Yeah, I mean, coming from languages, I've spent most of my time in languages that have global namespaces, and I can tell you that's terrible as well. Java tried to do the right thing to fix that by saying we're going to solve this problem and not have any of these ugly naming conflicts, but the price for doing that is Java class names, and I don't think anyone wants that. No. Like piggybacking on another system to disambiguate com.whatever. It's gross, right? So that's why I was excited about Swift not having per module names and it can all work it out or whatever. But the fact that this surfaced to me already, again, not in my running app, but only in the Swift preview, maybe it's a bug with Xcode, but either way, I want to not, my whole point with naming is I want to just do the right thing and then never have to worry about it. And that's no longer the case. Now I have to be careful. Oh, you want to name something in your app? Be careful, because there may be some other important part of the machinery of building your app that it gets angry about that and breaks in a weird way. And, you know, I'm not so upset by it that I'm going to go back to Marco's thing and prefixing everything, because I find that more offensive, but it does give me a little bit of pause when I name my classes. And yes, before you send feedback, I totally should learn how namespacing works in Swift, but I haven't yet.
Yeah, another great example of this is if you were to use to create a widget for an app and use the default names, if I'm not mistaken, and Steve Troughton-Smith tweeted about this a while ago and then just retweeted himself. So hi, Steve. If you name your widget, then it yells at you because that's not allowed, because it conflicts with some of the Apple stuff, and the error message is completely inscrutable as to what's going wrong. And so you eventually, when I was first messing around with widgets, I just renamed it to like Casey widget or something like that, and then suddenly everything started working, and I was deeply frustrated.
Yeah, there's a bunch of pitfalls like that in Perl, where like half the time I see someone really scratching their head, whether it's at work or on the internet, of like, I cannot figure out why this code doesn't work, and the answer is like, rename your class. And they're like, what? I'm like, just
go with it. Just go with it.
You named it test, but let me just, or like you named one class A and one class B, and let me tell you about the B namespace in Perl. I know this is going to sound weird, but like, and that's just, they're excited to learn the solution, but then they're so angry.
I write PHP. Nothing sounds weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness! All right, so you do like some things, you don't like some other things. What do you miss about Objective C? I mean, obviously you were expert level at Objective C, and I would say, with respect, you're probably not expert level at Swift at this point. But other than that, are there specific things that you feel like, oh man, I really miss Objective C's ridiculously awful block syntax?
Objection, leading the witness.
Yeah. I do miss a lot of the simplicity of the language. I miss how Objective-C did not make it easy to hide behavior from reading code. Like, you could read the code, and because it was a fairly small language in its syntax and things like that, it was hard to hide behavior in ways that couldn't be easily looked into or noticed when reading it, whereas Swift does not have that. I also miss a lot of the style of like the API naming and searchability and documentation and things like that. I definitely miss the reliability and speed of the tools and the builds. I still, how many years are we into Swift? It still doesn't build very quickly, and I still occasionally get really weird behaviors that are solved by restarting Xcode. And I think we're a little late for that.
Have you tried writing much, much smaller apps?
Yeah. My favorite error is the one where it says, like, this is more common in Swift UI, which of course is much younger and much more of a giant pile of hacks. But my favorite one is the one where it says, like, this can't be evaluated in a reasonable time. You got to break it up into sub chunks or whatever.
Yeah.
Type inference. It's
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it's non-deterministic, but sometimes it goes off the rails. At least it tells you and doesn't try forever to figure out what the type is supposed to be. I'm going to object slightly to your hidden functionality. Objective-C supports pound define. Talk about hiding functionality. Again, referencing Perl. If you look at the Perl source code, you're like, what language is this written in? The answer is macros. It's written in pound define macros everywhere. So, and you could say, well, you shouldn't use pound define that way and blah, 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 but that's exactly the argument people make about, say, operator overloading. It's like, yes, the feature can be abused to make your code terrible, but don't do that. Pound define is the ultimate feature that can be abused to make your code completely incomprehensible and doing hidden things. You don't do that because you're a good Objective-C programmer. I think the same applies to Swift.
While this is not unqualified, there are things about header files that I miss.
Really?
You're a monster.
You are a monster.
I like the way that they very easily make like a public list of, like, here's how I expect this thing to be called publicly, and here it is in 10 lines.
I feel like it's an IDE issue, don't you?
Well, maybe. But yeah, I mean, as opposed to, in Swift, it's like you have this giant file that's this entire class, and 4 of the functions in it are public, but there's no quick way to see what that is outside of, like, the drop down in Xcode.
Yeah, like, it would be better if you could, like, collapse it all, and like they could even give a header view. That if you can annotate the code to say which one is the public API, then give a little view in the navigation that says, oh, this is the equivalent of the header, and it just shows function signatures of the public ones. Like, I think that is a surmountable thing because the information is all there, and I like the fact that it's all one file, and I like the fact that I don't have to make header files. And if you want that view of things, I feel like that's something that Xcode should offer. I find myself in the same situation, and what I don't want to do is like, oh, well, I'll just come up with a naming convention myself, and I'll put leading underscores in all the internal ones or some crap like that, because that's gross. But we all have all the metadata in the language to provide you essentially a header view without you having to type one, and that's something that would be a nice addition.
There is something that's similar to this in Xcode, and I've seen it like once. It's buried. It's so far down, it might as well be in China, and I cannot remember where it is, but there's a way to do something like this. You can get Xcode to extract something that vaguely looks like a header file. God, I'm looking around right now trying to figure it out, and I can't figure it out. So.
Yeah, you don't want it to be extracted, though. You just want it to be like a view. You know what I mean? Like it could be in your sidebar, and you click on it, and it's a non-editable thing, like in the same type of experience. Or like, what is it? Show counterpart. I don't remember the names of these commands in the Objective-C days, but you could switch back and forth from the .m to the .h, you know?
Oh, yeah. There's the mini-map that is in Xcode now, which I actually really like.
Ugh, I always turn that off.
Oh, I like it. But there's I cannot remember how to do this, and it's going to drive me nuts. Maybe we'll have a follow-up next week.
While you wait, I will try to fend off some feedback. And yes, I know it's the C preprocessor that I was referencing and not pound define, but I hope everyone is on the same page as me here. No one in the chat room corrected me yet. I'm a little bit disappointed, actually.
We are sponsored this week by Flatfile. One of the worst ways to spend your time is manually formatting customer spreadsheets. Thankfully, our friends at Flatfile have created Portal, the elegant import button, so your users can confidently import their data without you ever having to format their messy Excel files again. Flatfile Portal is a turnkey data importer for your product that automatically formats, validates, and transforms customer spreadsheets so the data is ready to use in your backend. That frees you and your customers from having to manually format spreadsheets for hours without needing to build a clunky in-house CSV importer. Flatfile's Portal integrates with virtually any application and in minutes can upgrade your customer data onboarding from emailing Excel files back and forth to importing even the messiest data correctly and on the first try. With Flatfile Portal, intuitive data imports will be the standard for your customers, your engineers, and your product teams. If you're interested in testing out Flatfile Portal, visit flatfile.io. That's flatfile.io. Thank you so much to Flatfile for sponsoring our show.
Alex Guthman writes, I know this has been slightly covered in previous Ask ATPs in episode 268 and 381, but do you guys have a non-ISP provided DNS server? If so, which ones do you use and why? Google, OpenDNS, Cloudflare, etc. For security or reliability or both? Will changing the DNS servers on my router improve network reliability or speed or privacy, even though it's not a VPN? So for me, I tried this like many years ago when this was very, very cool to use like Google or some other, I forget what else it was, but Google's DNS, maybe it was OpenDNS. And I tried it for a while, and the experience I had, again, many years ago now, was that anything that involves streaming like Netflix or YouTube or something like that was all slower than dirt because some way, somehow, and this is beyond my knowledge, it was apparently through the magic of DNS that they would target me to a server physically near my house. And when I was using a DNS based out of like California, everything slowed down to a crawl. And so I stopped doing this within the span of like a couple of weeks. That very well may not be the case anymore. So I have no idea. And I'll let the guys correct me here in a second. But what I will say is that for maybe a year now, I've been using Pi-hole on my local network, which is the most delightful and terrible name in the world. That's P-I-H-O-L-E. And what this is a DNS server that you run on a Raspberry Pi or in Docker. And it has a bunch of block lists that will block things like advertisements and some malware and things of that nature. And so I have my Raspberry Pi running Pi-hole, and that is my local network's DNS server. But when it doesn't know the answer to something, it will just go to my ISP, to Fios's DNS server. Marco, what do you do?
I just run the Fios. I just run my ISP's DNS server. I have very occasionally tried things like OpenDNS or like the Google ones or the Cloudflare ones, and I too have had occasional issues with them, and it's never been worth dealing with those issues for the benefit they provided. And so I would always switch back after a few weeks or a few days or whatever, just back to my ISPs. It's just this solves problems I don't have, or it introduces problems I'm not willing to tolerate.
Yeah. John?
So back in I guess it may be my cable days when I had cable internet access, the reason I became interested in alternate DNS providers is that my DNS provider through my ISP was garbage. And, it's the old saying of people who have ever debugged weird problems on the server side, it's always DNS. When you have a DNS problem, you're like, what's wrong with my computer? Nothing works. I can't understand. If you don't know enough network debugging to immediately check whether your thing is hanging trying to resolve a name, right? You're like, especially if you can't see the internals of some system, like everything is not working and something it's in somewhere is like trying to look up a name and your stupid ISP's DNS server is not down, it's up, but it's giving the world's slowest responses. It's incredibly frustrating. So that's why I started looking into them. It's tricky for you to tell whether that's happening to you, because unless you're literally debugging your own server-side code where you control where, names are converted into IP addresses or whatever, you probably don't know the internal guts of some set-top box or some app that you're using is hanging on DNS, and it's difficult to figure that out. But it could be that in the wide world of crappy ISPs, especially in the US, you too also happen to have a crappy ISP DNS server that you're using, and it's causing your browsing experience to be crap. So I think for the average person, if you're nerdy and you want to try this, it is worth looking into Cloudflare, Google, OpenDNS. In fact, I think there's an app, at least for the Mac anywhere, that does like DNS benchmarking. They will try a bunch of DNS servers and tell you which one is the fastest responding from your location. That doesn't tell you anything about reliability, but at least it can tell you like how fast you get the responses back. And honestly, speed isn't an issue unless you have a garbage ISP that's waiting, seconds to give you your names back, which can really hurt things. But that's why I started experimenting with it. And I benchmarked a bunch of them, and it turned out the one that was the fastest was one I hadn't heard of. So instead, I just tried using the Google one. And when I saw this question, I left it in here, and I intentionally didn't look this up because honestly, I don't know which of my computers and devices are using which DNS server. I'm pretty sure some of them are still using Google DNS, but I'm also sure that some of them are just using my ISP one because I never configured them, right? I didn't change my DNS at the router level or anything. And a lot of times your router is your DNS server. You can just specify, 10.0.1.1 or whatever. Like your main router will also do the DNS things. And they can just delegate to that. But I'm pretty sure some stuff in my house is using Google DNS. And the fact that I don't know tells me that I don't have any problem with it because I stream things from everywhere. Everything's fine. I get fast internet speeds. I get fast uploads, fast downloads. And I honestly don't know which one I'm using. So I think I have Fios as well. And I think the Fios DNS is fine. Like that's not why I was exploring it. I started exploring it, I think back when I had like Media One, which turned into Comcast. Anyway, for listeners, I'd say it's worth checking out. But what Casey said about potential GUIP stuff, I know Google does a bunch of stuff to counteract that, where even though you're doing 8.8.8.8, it's not the same 4.8s that other people are using. Like it's GUIP bounced from your lookups. It's, they try to be clever about that. And things like OpenDNS and Cloudflare have similar systems to not have the CDN streaming problem that you have, but, there's no guarantee that it'll work for you. So I'd say check it out. But I feel like it's less important now than it used to be. And if your ISP DNS is working fine, just stick with that.
Nathan Roberts writes, there are people in the Mac community who dislike Electron apps and modern web frameworks. I also dislike when resources are wasted for computing tasks that could be done in a more efficient way. But the history of computing is full of evolution. The difference between quote-unquote native versus quote-unquote web becomes intellectual when the software works well. See, for example, Visual Studio Code. Is there a problem with this tech that I don't understand? Is this an old man yells at cloud situation, or are we about to get rained on? Yeah, this was actually reasonably well put. I would also say that Visual Studio Code is an incredibly good example of something that is written in Electron that doesn't seem to be. It's very much visually, and in so many ways actually, cut from its own cloth, but it doesn't feel like a slow piece of garbage. And so to back up a half step, Electron is a way to build a native-ish app using web frameworks. So Slack, for example, is Electron. I believe Skype now is Electron. And the guys will probably have more concrete complaints about it. But what I don't like about Slack and about Skype is that so much of it feels so not native and so wrong and is missing affordances that I would expect. And I wish I could cite some more specific examples, and I can't off the top of my head, but there's just a general wrongness to it that bothers me and frustrates me, and at worst offends me. And I think Slack, for all my complaining about it, does mostly get the job done and mostly does a pretty decent job of it. But unlike Visual Studio Code, where I don't really ever tell, I can't even ever tell that I'm using a weird mechanism to run this app, it always just feels like something is not right in Slack. And that's what's so frustrating about it. I don't know, John, can you be more explicit and concrete about this than I am?
I think you hit on the two main complaints, and it's not just one about like Electron. One is the speed thing. Like in general, web-based technologies have always lagged behind native in terms of speed and responsiveness. But computers are getting faster, and that is only going to fade with time, as Nathan points out, right? That technology marches on, and what some people might say is incredibly inefficient or whatever eventually just becomes trivial and a non-issue. But the second thing is not going to go away based on performance, and that is the nativeness feeling, not in terms of responsiveness, but just like what are the native widgets and how do they work? With an Electron app, you will always be at best trying to imitate the operating system's incarnation of a button, a scroll bar, a text field, a rich text editing field, like even down to the window in some cases, right? Those things exist, right? As of today, except perhaps in something like Chrome OS or whatever, there are native UI toolkits and native UI controls for menu bars, buttons, checkboxes, scroll bars, scrolling view, text, everything, right? And you can, with an Electron app, you can either say, we're going to make our own interface elements out of web stuff, out of HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and you could try to make them look like the OS ones, which is a losing battle because the OS keeps moving. You're constantly going to be chasing it, and you're never going to be exactly like it. So there's the uncanny valley thing. Or you can do what Visual Studio Code and other apps do, is say, well, I'm not going to even bother trying to look like the native stuff. I'm going to look like my own thing, and it'll be good, and you'll like it. But no one will ever be fooled into thinking it is OS native. And that can work, except part of the promise of the GUI from the original Mac is if you learn one set of controls and behaviors, that knowledge transfers, right? So every time I'm in a text field, I can use these keyboard shortcuts and I can do these things and it behaves in this way with respect to selection. Every time I see a scrolling view, it respects my OS preferences for scrolling and clicking to jump the scroll wheel versus clicking to move it, and all my, swipe gestures and all that stuff. Like that expectation are thwarted as you have more and more Electron apps that don't use native controls, and each one of them has their own idea of what they want to do. Oh, they're going to try to imitate the OS thing, but they failed to implement this feature, or they're not going to try it, and you have to remember in this app it works this way. So the complaint about Electron, the performance complaints may fall by the wayside, but the non-native thing will only fall by the wayside if we ever get to a point where there are essentially more non-native apps than there are native apps. I don't think that we're there yet, and even if we were there, the non-native apps are not going to all get in a big, conference call with each other and decide how they want their widgets to behave. Then you're going to be back to the bad old days of everyone deciding how they want their app to work and not having like your sort of muscle memory and habits transfer from one app to the other. So I wouldn't want to live in that world. I understand that the web is kind of like that now. It's part of what makes websites frustrating, that there's so much variance between them. I still kind of like the idea of a GUI with a set of controls that act consistently between apps because that makes my computing life easier.
The only thing I would add is that there's also just a pretty significant issue about memory footprint and battery life with a lot of these apps. I actually don't have a huge amount of complaining to do about UI consistency with these apps, because when Electron is being used in many cases, like I think Slack, it's hard to picture like what would a quote native Mac, Aqua or AppKit, what would that look like for Slack? And I don't know what that I don't think it would work. I think it would end up looking a lot like this and working a lot like this, and so it would be a lot of custom stuff anyway. And it's like whether they're rendering custom stuff with a web view or with custom quartz drawing commands, if it's a bunch of custom stuff, it's still gonna behave in a custom way. So I don't actually have a big problem with a lot of that. with some of these apps.
I can give you a specific example from Slack, though, by the way, with the native thing. One of the things that frustrates me about Slack, which I use every day a lot, is the interface for editing a message, right? The little, like the hover pop-up thing that lets you get the little thing. There's like more actions and you can click edit and you can like add a reaction or whatever. The sort of active areas that brings up that UI, it's just so like twitchy that I can never quite get the message that I want. And if it was a native Mac app, not just from a technological perspective, but if it was a good native Mac app, the developer would spend a lot of time sweating over how that interface feels, and they would have per pixel control, and like they can essentially write custom code to do the mouse in and out handling and do all sorts of the things that the very best native Mac apps do. Whereas with web technologies, they're just going to be like, we've got the mouse in and mouse out event, or the hover event in our web thing, and that's sufficient. And it makes for a UI that's usable but feels twitchier to me. So I get what you're saying about like the app would more or less probably look the same, and I think Slack is a very good Electron app, and in general they do pretty well. Like, for example, one of the things I tested was I went into the text field and then I hit Control-A, use Emacs key bindings to jump around in the text field, and that totally works, mostly because Apple does a good job of making their web controls, like, the WebKit controls support native Mac toolkit type things. So it's not bad. In fact, I really like the Slack app, but I don't have trouble finding places where if it was a native Mac app, even if it more or less looked the same, that it would behave differently in ways that I feel like could be superior just due to the extra control I have. And again, this is not even talking about consistency, because you're right that like, well, what would the editing control look like? There's no like native control for that, and you certainly wouldn't want a button next to everything. So it would have to be some kind of custom UI, but I feel like it would be a more Mac feeling interaction for the custom UI.
Maybe. I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to like care and craftspersonship as opposed to like, the framework they're using to do it. I mean, I look at something like Things, which is my preferred to-do app on the Mac, on all platforms. And Things has an incredibly highly custom UI. It does not look like AppKit. It does not look like Aqua. It looks like its own incredibly custom thing. But they wrote it in AppKit. Like, it is using the native APIs. It's not a web app at all. I have used other to-do apps. I've tried them that were web apps that were web technology based, even in their Mac quote apps. They sucked. Like, they were terrible, and that's why I don't use them. And that wasn't an issue of like it was impossible to make a good Mac UI using web technologies. It was that they just didn't. Somebody could do it. It is possible. And a good Mac UI, as Things demonstrates, doesn't have to be exactly like, vanilla Aqua controls. It can be done in a good way. And I think Slack gets very close. I think Slack, as Electron apps go, is a very good one. There are limitations of it being an Electron app. It does take a comically long amount of time to launch. It is comically wasteful of resources. They've had to do a ton of work over time to make it slightly less egregious at how much memory and stuff that it burns. But I think that's like the big problem with them is like it's a very Electron and using web technologies to do UIs is a very heavy thing, and so it has to be really worthwhile. Now, if you're doing something like Slack, which is a very complicated app, I think that might be acceptable. If you're doing something like VS Code, I've never used VS Code, but I know people love it. A programmer's text editor is such a massive tool that if that becomes a heavy thing that in the system, it's not that big of a deal. Xcode is damn heavy. I mean, it's IDEs are all heavy things. So
I mean, that's what I would categorize Visual Studio Code as. Is more of an IDE and less of just a text editor. And in that respect, like I would not want Xcode to be written with web technologies.
Right?
Oh no! Like I feel like not that I'm saying Visual Studio Code is a bad IDE. I think it's a really good one. But I understand why it's written the way it's written, but I'm also really, really glad that Xcode isn't written like that.
Yeah, and I'm really, really glad that most of my apps that I use are not written like this, because imagine, right now I have two such apps open. I have Skype and Slack open, and like I look at my dock and I have like 10 other apps open, all of which are native, except for those two, as far as I know, it would be very inconvenient for the resource level of my system if 9 of those apps were all Electron apps. Like, it's one of those things where, like, if you have 1 or 2 of these, it's no big deal, but it becomes much heavier. Because they're so heavy, it becomes much more burdensome to have more than a couple of them. And so it's not a good idea for most apps to do this. And it's not a good idea to do this if what you want to do with your app can be easily done with the native frameworks. But when you look at something like Slack and you look at like what they actually need on Slack is a very complicated UI that is often rendering web content, that is often rendering HTML, like for just things like it's a giant rich text view that has a lot of embedded images and stuff like that. Like that, even if you wrote that with like AppKit and native code, you'd probably implement it as largely a web view. And so like much of your UI would be rendered using web technology anyway. Like you wouldn't be saving a massive amount of resources by doing it that way. You would just introduce, complexity at the engineering side. And Slack is this like very complex, rich service that has to run on every platform. And it has to have feature parity constantly on every platform. And so again, like you can see why they do this. I don't love that this is the reality of a lot of things these days, but that's why they do it, and it makes a lot of sense. But if that's not your business needs, if you can get away with using native stuff and it's not that big of a deal to your business, then by all means, it's better and you should. But something like Slack, I think, is Electron for good reasons, and it doesn't bother me that much, with the exception of quite how incredibly resource intensive it is.
You should think about getting a Mac with more than 16 gigs of RAM.
Ooh, brutal. Matt Steiner writes, recent Apple car rumors seem to suggest they're working toward an autonomous EV to sell to customers. What do you guys think of the idea of Apple designing an autonomous EV to be used in their own ride-sharing service akin to Uber? Apple controls the hardware and software and can focus on the experience, ultra-high-end interior, ecosystem integration, advanced technologies, without needing to worry about pricing, margins, dealerships, or charging networks. Similar to Waymo, they can focus their self-driving tech on well-mapped geographies, cities ideal for ride-sharing, to create a polished system that doesn't necessarily need to operate everywhere in the way a consumer EV would. This doesn't really do anything for me personally. Like, I don't see this as a sustainable, reasonable model for a business to make decent money. I just get by gut alone, I just get the feeling that this is not what Apple's interested in. That it's not, they don't want to be Uber. They don't want to, at most they might want to be Uber for like shuffling employees between their different buildings in Cupertino. But even then, I don't think they're that interested. So yeah, I don't think this is for them.
This harkens back to the good old days of Apple rumors, where you start with the premise that Apple is able to do something that no one else thus far has been able to do, and then you extrapolate from there. Oh, what if Apple could just do this thing that apparently nobody in the world can do yet? But like, what if Apple could do it because they're super smart? Then do you think Apple would do that? If Apple could make hoverboards, they'd probably do it. But I don't think, the making fully autonomous cars and selling them and saying, wouldn't that be a great service? Because you don't have to worry about dealers because Apple would own all the cars and everything. Like, I see the appeal, but let's start with, okay, well, where did the fully autonomous cars come from? I mean, I guess it's just assuming Apple will be able to do that where everyone else has failed after decades of trying. Eventually maybe, but I don't see anything that as far as I know, Apple is not far ahead of the competition when it comes to full autonomy for this type of application. Now, in terms of if we start from that premise, though, and say, okay, well, so let's assume this is just a thing that everybody can do, right? Would Apple want to be in that business? Because I don't think you can start and say, okay, what if Apple was the only one that could do this? Then wouldn't they want to be in that business? There's very little that Apple will be able to do that people can't copy, right? So it's like, what if Apple's the only one with a smartphone with a touchscreen? For a tiny little while, they were like, a smartphone with a good iPhone caliber touchscreen. But eventually everyone else had one. So Apple had better hope their competitive advantage is not, hey, we're the first ones to figure out how to do this, because that won't be true for very long. So you have to assume the world is, a place where everybody can do this. Google could make this service, Amazon can make this service, Hertz can make this service. Then is it a business that Apple wants to be in? And you got to ask the Tim Cook question. Is this a place where Apple feels like they can make a big impact? Yada, yada. And I would hope from the high level perspective, what Apple would say to itself is not like, is there a buck to be made while we're the first people to do this? But is this type of product going to solve a problem in the world in a way that we want? In some respects, yes. Like if you could have a autonomous fleet of cars that are shared in a city environment, and then pair that with banning people from bringing their own cars, you could reuse existing infrastructure with fewer cars on the street in a more efficient manner. But in other respects, if you really want to solve the problem, the solution is not to either add more cars or to have different kinds of cars, but rather to invest in more efficient, nicer public transportation, which carries people, far larger number of people more efficiently with less space, stuff like that. And I would hope that any Apple thinking about a future product is thinking big picture. Is the answer more cars? Now, I know Apple's rumored to be making a car, and I hope they're also asking that question. And the reality is cars are, a big thing in the entire world right now. So you can't stick your head in the sand and say, I'm just going to ignore cars entirely. But for something like this, where you have, we have autonomy and we have this amazing advanced technology, I would hope that we would think a little bit bigger than let's just do cars, but slightly different, because that type of technology enables all sorts of interesting things, other than simply trying to use our existing road infrastructure slightly more efficiently.
Yeah, I still, there's a lot of smoke where this fire is alleged to be. And so I'm pretty sure that Apple is working on some kind of car.
Or car-related thing, as in maybe they're just doing the software. Maybe they're partnering with Hyundai to, there's so many rumors. We don't know yet.
Yeah, but it's Apple. I don't think Apple wants to be in the business of being the partner with Uber or Hertz to supply them. That's like a big B2B deal. Apple sucks at that kind of thing. They're not going to make some kind of big sales deal with some other person who's going to share the major parts of the responsibility of the customer relationship and customer experience. They're going to do the whole thing themselves.
You're thinking Motorola Rocker though, and I'm thinking Foxconn.
Fair enough.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair. But ultimately, this thing where Apple just makes a fleet of cars for Uber or whoever to operate, and you don't actually buy them. You just get into this car designed by Apple.
No, not for Uber to operate. The idea in this question is that Apple would run that service, so Apple would own all the cars. It wouldn't be selling cars to end users. Right. It would be selling access to the Apple car transport service.
At that point, Apple's just like a giant car leasing company and car maintenance company.
They're a taxi service.
Yeah, I don't see that. First of all, I don't see that being a business Apple would really want to be in.
Services revenue.
But secondly, I still don't know why Apple wants to be in the car business at all. This doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I can tell, obviously, they're putting a lot of resources into this project. There's so much supporting that now that it does seem like they do have some kind of major car project going and have for some time. But I still just do not see why Apple wants to or should be in the car business. And even as a huge fan of Apple and an okay fan of cars, I don't want an Apple car. I'm not excited about that. I don't think they should be doing any of this. I think this is a massive distraction, and I have yet to imagine why this is a good idea for them to do, why they need to do this, why they need to spend any of their resources doing this, why Apple can bring something to the table here, why they would even be good at it. I don't see any of that. I don't see anything in Apple's product line. It says, part of this question is, Apple can control the hardware and software, and you can focus on the experience. Ultra high-end interior, ecosystem integration, advanced technology. What does that mean? Can Apple make an ultra high-end car interior? Maybe, but we've never seen that before. But when they launched the Apple Watch, they had never made an ultra high-end, watch band ecosystem before, but they managed to make a pretty good one. I wouldn't maybe not ultra high end, but they managed to make very good watch bands and a decent watch experience. Like I suppose they could try this, but Apple, like, this is so far from the kinds of things they do. You mentioned earlier, like the Tim Cook thing of like trying to make a real difference and to only tackle the things that they can make a real difference in. It's like they decided not to do Wi-Fi routers. Why? There's so many things that they could do that would make a real difference to the business that they're already in. And they choose not to for focus or resources or whatever. A car, let alone even if you ignore all the magic self-driving stuff that seemingly doesn't exist and might never exist, even if you ignore that, just making a car, period, even a manually driven one where one is driven by a human, it's so much work. And it's so many specialty skills, and it takes so much infrastructure and so much support, massive amounts of design and engineering, and just such a massive distraction. Apple is not known for having a ton of extra engineering and design resources and the ability to multitask incredibly well while juggling all their other product lines. Why are they doing this? I have no clue why they're doing this. And maybe I'm totally wrong, and maybe they're going to blow us away, in 5 or 10 years or whenever. But it sure looks to me like just a giant distraction, a giant, like, massive resource suck that is not a good idea strategically for them at all. I don't see what this does for them. I don't see why Apple wants to be a car company or why they should become a car company. No matter what the car, even if it's fully autonomous cars or manually driven cars, no matter what kind of car it is, I don't see why Apple needs to or should or would be good at doing this.
I'm sure Apple will explain it when they roll out whatever they roll out. But the really concerning / interesting thing about this is Apple is seemingly so committed to whatever the heck they're doing in the car space that when their first run at it sort of, I'm going to say failed, but didn't work out the way they wanted, they didn't abandon the idea. They rebooted it and are making at least a second attempt. We don't know how many other internal restarts there have been, but there's been one public restart that we more or less know. So sure, that's the thing in any big company, especially Apple. You try lots of stuff. Sometimes it doesn't work out. But when the car thing didn't work out, they didn't say, oh, well, we tried that. It didn't work out. They're trying again. And so they are determined to do whatever it is they're doing here. And you mentioned Wi-Fi routers. If and when AirTags ever actually come out after however many years being rumored, I'm just going to look at them and say, so you're doing AirTags, but still no Wi-Fi routers, huh? You can make a big difference in the tile business, but you can't make a difference in the Wi-Fi router business. To your point about like so many areas in their current market where they could make a difference and aren't. AirTags seems like, God, like really? Or is there so little for you to do that you thought, why don't we do these little tile competitor things? That'll be fun. I mean, not that AirTags are probably being great. I think they're cool and everything, but not Wi-Fi routers, right? But also cars. It really is baffling. And I don't want to discourage Apple from trying all sorts of different things. But the car thing, I feel like eventually it's either got to just be dead for good or they need to ship something. The AR/VR glasses is another example. I think that's definitely an area that Apple should be looking in. And I like the idea that they've been working on it for a long time and haven't shipped anything yet because it shows they're not just shipping the first random thing they have, because we know they've had all sorts of stuff internally that other companies probably would have shipped because it probably is cool and does a bunch of cool stuff. But they're waiting until they have something decent. So I hope whatever they're doing with the car comes out, that Apple is able to answer at least some of the questions that Marco just posed, because if they can't, it's not going to be much of a product introduction.
Thanks to our sponsors this week, Linode, Away, and Flatfile. Thank you to our members as well who support us directly. You can join at atp.fm/join. Thanks, everybody. We will talk to you next week.
Now the show is over. They didn't even mean to begin, 'cause it was accidental. Oh, it was accidental. John didn't do any research. Marco and Casey wouldn't let him, 'cause it was accidental. Oh, it was accidental. And you can find the show notes at atp.fm. And if you're into Twitter, you can follow follow them at CASEYLISS. So that's Casey Liss, MARCOARMENT, Marco Arment, SIRAC, USA, Syracuse. It's accidental. They didn't mean to. Accidental. Tech podcast so long.
So, keeping with the car theme, I have a group chat that I think I've mentioned before that is myself and two car enthusiast friends of mine, and it's not the two of you. One of them is the guy that recommended the Subaru, the BMW, and now has basically a clone of my car, except his is the wrong transmission. And we were chatting, the three of us, the other day, and one of them, I forget which one it was, made the point, what's the point of Audi? And I should have looked back at this conversation in preparation for today, but if you want to get something Audi-like, why would you get an Audi when you can get a Volkswagen that's like 90% as nice in most cases, but half the price? Or if you want to go to the other direction, you want something that's obscenely nice and just obscenely expensive, then get a Porsche. So what's the point in Audi?
I mean, setting aside the fact that the corporate ownership structure that we have today didn't always exist, and so it wasn't quite as absurd a question. I think you just basically described market segmentation. The whole idea of regular car brands eventually having a luxury brand companion was big in the 90s and is a proven business model. You take your Toyotas and you make them a little bit fancier and you sell them for way more money and you get a Lexus. You do the same thing with a Nissan and you get Infinitis to lesser effect. Take a Honda and you make it a little bit fancier and you get an Acura, which is usually a worse car, and you should just buy Hondas. But like that,
see, I'm saying
it's a proven business model. And I think in the case of Volkswagen Audi, the Volkswagen is the regular people brand. You take a Volkswagen, you make it fancier, and you get an Audi. And yes, obviously you're paying more and the margins are higher and you're not getting, quote unquote, your money's worth if you look at it in terms of features and experience or whatever. But that's market segmentation and luxury goods. You always pay proportionally more to get proportionally less. But I don't think there are many people who would say that a really good Audi is not a nicer car than a really good Volkswagen, even if they're literally made on the same platform. So I think it makes just as much sense as, I keep citing Infiniti. I feel bad for them because I think their cars are crappy. But what's Lexus, I guess. Lexus is the best one because Toyota is a very popular brand, sells a lot of cars, and Lexus are acknowledged to be, yes, they're just fancy Toyotas. But guess what's a fancy Toyota is a good car. And for people who like Toyotas but wish they were fancier, Lexus is right there for them, and there's bigger margins on it. So the point of Audi is the same as the point of Lexus and Infiniti.
Well, okay, Acura. I guess I phrased the question poorly. Why would one buy an Audi rather than, other than like completely emotional reasons, like I just want to look fancy?
It's nicer. They have higher performance. You can get the RS6 or RS7. There's no equivalent Volkswagen one of those. And you can get higher performance cars with fancier interiors with more luxury features for way more money. That's a luxury brand.
Right. And Porsche is an even higher step above that. So Audi is like, a good choice if you want something fancier from that car family than the Volkswagen, but you don't want to go all the way to Porsche, which is substantially more expensive and has
much more sporting and less luxurious, right?
I don't know if I would say that.
Less luxurious in that the ride quality is harsher.
Yeah, maybe. It's been a long time since I've been in a Porsche, but I'm not so sure it's quite as harsh in most applications as you're painting it.
If you're not getting the performance version of an Audi, the ride is going to be much more comfortable in it than any Porsche.
Yeah.
I can't argue with you, but I'm not so sure that you should be as confident as you are.
Anyway, I don't think I don't know who made this point, but I think it's just if you find Audi pointless, then you should find all luxury car brands pointless because what's true of Audi is true of all of them. Maybe the complaint is the Audis that are they're too much like the Volkswagens. Like if you squint, you can see the Volkswagen lurking under the covers, but I don't really buy that. I think Audi makes cars that appeal to people who like Audis, and I find some of them appealing and some of them not to my taste, but I never question why the brand exists. It makes perfect sense to me.
I guess unlike BMW, which doesn't really have a cheap brand, like I guess kind of sort of Mini-ish.
They made that hatchback, remember
Mini
that?
is not cheap.
I mean, the Mini is not cheap. You're exactly right. And yes, the 318 Ti, I believe it was, which our valedictorian drove, and it seemed like a piece of garbage. There's no cheap BMW. There's no cheap Mercedes that I can think of, right? So there's no real equivalent in Audi's two main competitors. Whereas if I were to look at an Audi, in almost all circumstances, I would almost surely get the equivalent Volkswagen. Now, yes, there are cases where there is no equivalent Volkswagen, but in almost all cases there are, and that's what I would certainly get, because it just seems to me like, why would one choose an Audi for non-emotional reasons? Why would one choose an Audi over the equivalent Volkswagen?
Why are you naming their competitors as being Mercedes and BMW? Is it just geographic competitors? Like, Lexus would say that they're a competitor to Audi.
I think you're right.
Acura would say that they're a competitor. Infiniti would say that, just excluding those luxury brands, like other, Cadillac would say that they're a competitor to Audi. Like, I feel like they're just the fact that, I think it's an accident of history that BMW and Mercedes just grew into these luxury brands and weren't spawned from sort of non-luxury brands, right? And, I don't think Mercedes started out as the luxury brand they are today, but they didn't get spun out of something. And the companies that did spin out of being like, the people's car, Volkswagen, right? Or Honda or Toyota or whatever, or even things like Ford, like when you come out of a brand that is trying to sell to the mass market, you eventually realize the business people say, we could make a little bit more money if we made a fancier version of this car and gave it a different name. And so you get Cadillac, right? You get the luxury brand spawning out of a regular brand. If you're not lucky enough, if you want to consider it, to be a luxury brand from day one. But if you are a luxury brand from day one, like Porsche, maybe you'll try to buy Volkswagen because they sell a lot of cars, but that didn't quite work out the way everyone thought it would.
I guess, to me, I don't really perceive the Japanese luxury makers, automakers as real direct equivalents, because I feel like
they're more reliable, too reliable to compete with the German brands.
yes, and I feel like they have a very different personality. Having driven several Japanese cars, admittedly not luxury cars, but I've owned a couple of Japanese cars in years past, and I've owned a couple of German cars now. And I feel like, and I don't know how to explain it concretely, but there's a very different attitude to your average Japanese car versus your average German or perhaps even European car, because I feel like Aaron's, semi-Swedish Volvo also feels German-ish, and so I think I should really be saying European.
How dare you? Volvos aren't German.
I'm saying they have a similar feel in spirit to them.
I mean, there's been a lot of homogenization, I feel like, in the luxury car segment. Like when Lexus first came out, it was so clearly targeting Mercedes. Like you just look at it and you look at the Mercedes that they were targeting. You're like, they just, I can tell who you're competing with. And yet, despite so clearly targeting Mercedes, the original LS400 could not help but feel Toyota-ish. Right? You just can't help it. You're right. You're totally right that it's in the culture. In the same way that a Cadillac, despite trying to compete with BMW, there is no question that you're in a Cadillac when you get into one of those things as opposed to being in a BMW. So the homogenization has been, I feel like, in the feature set and maybe even in sort of internal amenities and aesthetics. But the values represented by the transmission, chassis, engine, like combination, driving experience, not setting even aside, obviously, the styling, is still radically different from the German brands, the American brands, the Japanese brands, the Swedish brands, the Chinese brands. And I think that's part of what makes the audio industry great, but I wouldn't say that eliminates them as competitors from each other. Like they're going to be different.
No, I don't mean to imply they're not competitors. I guess what I'm saying is I think in the same way that Volkswagen, Audi, and Porsche occupy different spaces, in my mind, and maybe I'm the only one, the European versus Japanese versus American luxury brands. I mean, nobody's even said Lincoln yet, but I think all three of those groups have, to your point and to the point I was trying to make earlier, very, very different attitudes and feelings and kind of spirit about them. And so even though I agree they are all competitors, I view them as only competing within their little circle. Like I personally, I don't think I would cross shop a BMW and a Cadillac or a BMW and a Lexus. Whereas I would absolutely cross shop a BMW and a Mercedes, for example. And I would cross shop a Cadillac and a Lincoln, and I would certainly cross shop an Acura. And I actually probably cross shop the Infiniti and a Lexus. But I don't know, it seems to me like, particularly with respect to Volkswagen Auto Group, there's a lot of overlap, and I can't put my finger on anything that I think Audi does extraordinarily well that would make me say, yes, I want an Audi. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, and one you pointed out earlier is there are cars that Audi makes that Volkswagen does not, and I don't have anywhere near enough money to afford an RS6, but if I was given infinite money tomorrow, I would bring an RS6 to my desert island because, oh my gosh, that thing looks so awesome. And even though the more correct answer for a really fast wagon is whatever the current Mercedes wagon is, that is certainly the better choice. But God, I love the look of the RS6 so much, and I want one so badly.
The Audi fast wagons are actually pretty good. Someone posted a link in the chat room. We'll put it in the show notes to a Car Wizard video showing a more modern Lexus versus a more modern Mercedes. I think people do cross shop Lexus and Mercedes, and Lexus apparently continues to ape the Mercedes styling and features and size and everything. So like I was thinking of the original LS400, which was what, 90s, the early 90s.
And they were nice cars.
But it was so clearly like just they looked at Mercedes S-Class and they said, let's make the Toyota version of that. And here is a modern video showing they continue to do that. And I think that's a good business because if you want a Mercedes but want it to be more reliable and even more comfortable, get a Lexus.